She wore a white dress to cover her bruises and walked into the wedding hall of the city's most dangerous crime boss. No flowers, no music, only guns, darkness, and a ring placed on her finger like a chain. Her father had sold her. Her husband was the man the whole world feared. And on that wedding night, instead of violence, he gave her a blanket and said, "No one is allowed into your room without permission." That should have been a relief. Instead, it terrified her more than ever. Where are you watching from? Please like and comment below to let me know how far this story has progressed. And let's follow this story to the end. The rain came down hard the night Serafina Vale was handed to a man who had buried people alive. She didn't know that detail yet. She would learn it later, the way she learned most things about Damien Draven, in fragments, in whispers, in the careful way his men stopped breathing whenever he entered a room. But on that particular Tuesday in November, standing in the back seat of an armored car crawling through harbor traffic, all she knew was what her father had told her 3 days prior while she sat at the kitchen table with a split lip and a cup of tea going cold in her hands. "The war is ending," Lucian Vale had said. "You're how it ends." He'd said it the same way he announced dinner reservations. The Black Cathedral rose above the harbor like something that had always existed and simply waited for the rest of the city to grow up around it. 40 stories of obsidian glass and black steel, no warmth in any window, just the cold blue light of a fortress that had never once pretended to be anything other than what it was. Serafina pressed her fingers together in her lap and counted her own heartbeats the way her childhood therapist had taught her. The therapist her father fired when Serafina was 12 for asking too many questions about the bruises. 1, 2, 3. The car stopped. A man in a black suit opened her door without speaking. He didn't offer his hand. He just stepped back and watched her climb out into the rain, and she felt the weight of that gaze the same way she felt every gaze from men who worked for dangerous people, like a temperature check, like they were measuring how much trouble she might be. She tucked her clutch under her arm and walked toward the entrance. The white silk dress cost $4,000. Her father had selected it. She'd stood in the boutique dressing room for 40 minutes while he and the stylist discussed fabric weight, and she counted the tiles on the floor. The dress was beautiful in the way expensive cages were beautiful. Carefully constructed, structurally sound, designed to hold something that would rather be somewhere else entirely. It also covered her arms completely, which was the only reason she'd agreed to wear it without argument. The lobby of the Black Cathedral smelled like cold marble and cigarette smoke, and something underneath both of those things that she couldn't name. Men stood at every corner in positions that looked casual and weren't. She recognized the posture from the security detail her father kept. That particular stillness of men who were paid to be ready to kill and had been ready for so long it had become their resting state. Nobody spoke to her. She was escorted to the elevator by a woman in a charcoal blazer who gave her name as Mara and offered nothing else. The elevator was mirrored on 3 sides, and Serafina caught her own reflection in all of them and immediately looked away. Her makeup was perfect. Her posture was perfect. She looked like exactly what her father had spent 22 years sculpting her into, a presentable surface over a ruin. The penthouse floor had no hallway. The elevator opened directly into a space that was simultaneously enormous and suffocating, all dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the harbor, and the rain-blurred lights of the city below. Flowers would have looked absurd here. This was not a space that accommodated softness. Damien Draven was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He didn't turn around immediately. The deliberateness of that bothered her more than she expected. She'd braced for cold eyes and aggression. She hadn't braced for someone who moved at his own pace without explanation and seemed to feel no need to announce himself. When he finally turned, she understood why everyone described him first by his stillness. He was tall in the way that meant nothing to him. Not performed, not aggressive, just architectural. Dark suit, no tie, collar open by one button, a jaw that looked like it had been built to absorb punishment, eyes so pale they registered gray from across the room. He looked at her the way someone looks at a contract, thoroughly, impersonally, without warmth but without cruelty either, and that absence of both things was its own category of disquieting. There were 6 other people in the room. She recognized the man in the corner as Judge Harlan, her father's oldest ally, a man who had dismissed 3 assault charges against people in Lucien Vale's orbit over the past decade. He was sweating through his collar. She found a small private satisfaction in that. The ceremony was handled by a man she didn't know who held a leather-bound registry and kept his chin tucked to his chest throughout. Not a priest, not anything official, just a man with shaking hands and the authority to make this real. And he was afraid of something in this room. And everyone in this room knew exactly what it was. Her father was present. Lucien Vale stood near the wet bar in a navy suit with a pocket square and the expression he wore at fundraising galas, measured benevolence, teeth slightly visible, the performance of a man who was accustomed to cameras even when there were none. He caught her eye across the room and gave her a single, small nod that meant behave, and she felt the familiar cold weight of that nod in her sternum and looked away. The ceremony took 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock above the bar the entire time, counting seconds the way she'd counted tiles, the way she'd counted stairs as a child climbing to the floor where her father's study was, the way she counted breaths before things happened that she couldn't stop. Damien said nothing additional to the required words. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man reading an ordinary document. He didn't look at her father. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Serafina for the duration of the ceremony with those pale eyes, and she kept her gaze fixed on his collarbone because she couldn't sustain eye contact, and she absolutely could not look away entirely without her father noticing, and finding that narrow middle ground required most of her concentration. When the ring went on her finger, it was cold, heavy, a flat dark band with no stone. She'd expected something ornate, something that announced ownership. This was the opposite, severe and minimal, like a line drawn. Damien leaned close enough that she smelled him. Smoke and something darker underneath, sandalwood maybe, and the faint clean bite of expensive whiskey. "You're shaking," he said quietly. Only for her. She hadn't realized. Her hands had betrayed her without permission, a fine tremor she couldn't locate and couldn't stop. She swallowed. "I thought you were going to kill me." The honesty surprised her. She hadn't planned to say that. It came out the way the truest things did, before the filter caught it. His expression didn't change, not a flicker. "Not tonight." He straightened. Then he looked at her father. The room temperature dropped. Serafina had seen powerful men look at each other her entire life. The calculations behind it, the measurements, the performances of dominance and deference. She knew every variation. What she saw in Damien Draven's face when he turned toward Lucien Vale was none of those things. It was simpler and more absolute. It was a man looking at something he had already decided about, and the deciding was done, and what remained was only timing. Her father's smile didn't disappear, but his hand, resting near his drink, went completely still. The cameras, two of her father's people with phones, stopped rolling. The other guests found reasons to move toward the elevator. Within 4 minutes, the room had emptied of everyone except Mara and two of Damien's men and Serafina, who stood in her expensive cage of a dress holding her clutch and waiting for the shape of whatever happened next. Damien walked past her without touching her. "Come," he said. Not unkind, not kind, just a direction, clean and without ornamentation, and she followed it the way she'd followed most directions in her life, because the cost of not following was a thing she already knew the shape of and had no interest in revisiting tonight. The private elevator off the penthouse opened to a separate residential level above. She hadn't known there was a level above. The ceilings here were lower, still high by ordinary standards, but proportioned for habitation rather than performance. The floors were the same dark hardwood, but the light was different, warmer, lamps rather than recessed fixtures, and there were books on built-in shelves along one wall, and the windows were rain-blurred, and the whole space felt like a different structure entirely from what existed below. Damien opened a door near the end of the hall without looking at her. "East wing," he said. "You sleep here. The code to the lock is your choice. Set it when you're ready, anything you want. No one enters without your permission. That includes me." She stood in the doorway of the room and processed this. It was large, clean. The bed had real pillows and a window seat overlooking the harbor and an absence of anything that felt designed to be watched. There was a bathroom with a door that locked from the inside, and she noticed the lock immediately, and her shoulders moved one small degree downward before she caught herself. "You're not angry," she said. It wasn't a question. She was trying to make sense of the geometry of his behavior and couldn't find the frame. Damien loosened one cufflink. His back was partially to her. "No." "Why not?" "I didn't marry you because I wanted a toy." She waited. "I married you because your father asked for mercy." He set the cufflink on the hallway table. "And because he had something I wanted, and trading for it this way cost less than the alternative." "What did he have?" Damien finally turned and looked at her with those gray eyes, and she had the sensation again of being assessed, not unkindly, not with hunger, but with a thoroughness that missed nothing. "Sleep," he said. "We talk tomorrow." He walked away. She stood in the doorway of the room for a moment after he disappeared, listening to the rain against the glass and the distant sound of the harbor. And then she stepped inside and set her clutch down on the window seat and stood very still in the middle of the floor and breathed. She had survived the night. That should have felt like something. Mostly it felt like the quiet before a different kind of storm. She didn't sleep. She sat in the window seat with her knees pulled up and watched the rain move across the harbor lights and tried to construct a logic for Damien Draven that she could hold on to. Men like him, and she had grown up inside the architecture of men like him, politicians and criminals, and the people who moved between both categories with practiced ease. Men like him operated on an exchange model. Everything was a transaction. Kindness was an investment. Patience was strategy. So what was the transaction here? What did he want that required her cooperation? She was still working the problem at 3 a.m. when she heard footsteps in the hall and went rigid, and then the footsteps passed her door without slowing and continued to the far end of the corridor, and she slowly unclenched her hands from around her own knees and pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let the rain do what rain sometimes did, gave her something external to focus on until the internal became manageable. She'd been doing that since she was 8. The Black Cathedral was different in the daytime, not less imposing, but inhabited in a way the nighttime ceremony hadn't suggested. Staff moving through lower floors on visible schedules. Damien's people cycling through shifts with a professionalism that was almost corporate in its efficiency. She spent most of the first day learning the residential level, mapping exits the way she always mapped spaces, noting which rooms she had visible access to and which ones stayed locked. Damien had a study at the opposite end of the residential wing. The door was open when she passed it mid-morning, and she stopped without planning to. He was on the phone, standing with his back to the door, speaking in a low, flat voice to someone about a shipment schedule. The words themselves were neutral, could have been any kind of goods, any kind of logistics. The tone was the tell. That particular cadence of a man who was accustomed to being disobeyed and was currently explaining, in the most controlled register possible, that this was not a conversation about options. He turned and saw her standing in the doorway. She expected irritation. He just looked at her steadily and held up one finger, a moment, and finished the call. "You need something?" he asked when he set the phone down. "I need to know what I'm allowed to do," she said. "In this building, I need the parameters." He looked at her for a moment, and she couldn't tell if the pause was calculation or something else. "You're not a prisoner," he said. "Everyone in this building has a gun." "Yes?" "And most of them work for you." "All of them work for me." "Then I need to understand what that means for me specifically," she said. "I need to know the rules. I function better with rules." She didn't mean to say that last part. It was the kind of true thing that exposed too much. Her father's house had operated on rules so arbitrary and shifting that she'd spent 2 decades in a state of permanent calibration, always measuring, always adjusting, always trying to anticipate the next correction. Structure was the thing she was most afraid of and most unable to function without. Damien studied her face with that particular attention of his. "The building's security is mine to manage," he said. "Your movements are your own. You want to leave? Tell Mara, take 2 men with you. Not because I'm restricting you, because the city isn't safe for people in your position right now. Your father made enemies on his way to making this deal, and some of them don't know or care about the terms." "My father makes enemies constantly," she said. "That's not new." "These enemies are new," Damien said. "The situation is new." He held her gaze. I'll explain more when I know more. For now, eat breakfast. You haven't eaten. How do you know that? Because you've been up since before 4 and you've walked past the kitchen 3 times. She hadn't realized he tracked that kind of detail. She should have. A man who ran what he ran without surveillance vulnerabilities tracked everything. Are you always watching? She asked. I'm always aware, he said. It's not the same thing. She left without responding, but she went to the kitchen and ate. It was the painting that started it. She'd always painted. Charcoal, mostly. There was something about the pressure of it, the way you could drag it and smear it and create depth through accumulation rather than precision, that suited the way she processed things. Her father had considered it a tolerable eccentricity as long as she kept it out of sight. Art was not part of the presentation. Art was a private dysfunction, like anything else she did that wasn't for the benefit of external perception. She found a supply closet on the residential level with blank canvas and charcoal, among other things. Either coincidence or something deliberate, she didn't know which, and she decided not to ask. She took what she needed and set up at the window seat in her room and worked. The first drawing was the harbor. The second was Mara. The third, without meaning to, was Damien. Not his face, exactly. She wasn't looking at him from close enough range to render his face accurately. Just his proportions, the architecture of how he stood, the way space organized itself around him. She worked on it for 2 hours, and when she looked at what she'd made, she sat with it for a long moment. He looked like what he was, enormous and still and somehow contained, all that potential for violence held inside a very deliberate silence. He also, she realized, looked tired, not in the body, in the way certain people carry something behind their eyes that doesn't have a name, but registers as weight, as the accumulated cost of a great many decisions that couldn't be unmade. She recognized it because she wore the same thing. He found her at it 4 nights later. She was at the window seat after midnight, working on something different. A woman she'd known briefly at university 3 years ago, before her father decided education was running too long and called her home. And she heard him in the doorway and didn't startle, which was notable. She'd been startling at doorways her entire adult life. "Can't sleep," she said, without looking up. "No." He leaned against the frame. He was in dark pants and a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and he looked less assembled than he did during the day, which she filed without processing. He looked at the drawings on the floor beside her. The harbor. Mara. His own outline. He picked up the last one. She kept drawing. "You make me look human," he said. The inflection was strange. Not dismissive. Something closer to surprised. "Maybe you are," she said. He set the drawing down carefully. She heard him in the doorway for another moment, and then he walked away, and she listened to the sound of his footsteps recede down the hall, and she put down the charcoal and pressed her fingers together in her lap and sat with the feeling that something had shifted by a very small but irrevocable degree. 3 weeks into the marriage, she found the files, not through snooping. Mara left a folder on the kitchen counter by accident, or not by accident. She still didn't fully understand Mara's loyalties, which ran somewhere alongside Damien's interests in a way that wasn't simple obedience. And when Serafina opened it, expecting building schedules, she found financial records, donation records, transfers in the low millions directed to a network of residential facilities, shelters, the header language said, transitional housing, legal support funds. The facilities were named plainly, without the kind of branding that existed to generate publicity. These were not donations made for photographs. She went through 15 pages before she heard Damien's voice behind her. "Those aren't yours." She turned. He was standing in the kitchen doorway in his jacket, which meant he'd just come in. "You fund these," she said. He looked at the folder. Something moved across his face that she couldn't categorize. "Mara shouldn't have left those out." "You fund shelters for trafficked girls." She kept her voice steady. "Personally. Not through a foundation, not through a company. These are your direct accounts." Serafina. "Why?" The pause was long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because I can," he said, "and because the people who should are too busy deciding if it's politically convenient." She looked at him. He met her gaze and then looked at the folder and then away. which was the closest thing to discomfort she'd ever seen from him. She put the folder down. She didn't say anything else about it. But that night, instead of working at the window seat alone, she sat at the kitchen table with her charcoal while Damien worked through documents at the other end, and neither of them spoke for 2 hours. And it was the first time in as long as she could remember that silence felt like something she'd chosen rather than something imposed on her. She made a mistake on a Thursday in December. She'd been reaching for something on the high shelf in the supply closet. She still didn't know who stocked it. It replenished itself like a question she'd stopped asking. And she stretched too far and the sleeve of her sweater rode up to her elbow. And she was alone, so it didn't matter. But when she came out of the closet, Damien was standing in the hall, and he was looking at her arm. She pulled the sleeve down. His face was entirely still. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." The word came out practiced and smooth, the way it had been smoothed by repetition. "I caught it on the shelf." He said nothing for a long moment. "Serafina." "I caught it on the shelf," she said again, steadier. Looking at him directly, which was a skill she'd developed specifically for moments like this, the necessary performance of someone with nothing to hide. He stepped back. He let her pass. But she felt him watching her down the hallway, and she turned the corner and leaned against the wall with her eyes closed and breathed through her nose and told herself it was fine. It was fine. He didn't know. Nobody knew. It was... Her sleeve had ridden up too far. She hadn't caught it in time. He'd seen the edge of something older than any shelf. That night she stayed in her room and worked until her hands cramped, and somewhere around 2 a.m. she heard his footsteps stop outside her door and then continue after a moment, and she pressed her charcoal down too hard and snapped it, and sat in the dark with the broken pieces in her palm and stared at the harbor lights and did not sleep. She didn't know what she was afraid of more, that he would ask again, or that the next time he did, she would tell him. She wouldn't have an answer for that until it was already too late. Because 3 days later, Damien came home soaked in blood from an attempt on his life, and she opened the door to help him, and her hands shook as she pulled his shirt away from the wound. And in the movement of that moment, her reaching, his stillness, the awful intimacy of someone bleeding in your arms, her own sleeve fell, and the fabric pooled at her elbow, and the lights were on, and there was no shelf to blame this time. Damien's hands went completely still. He looked at her back. The room went quiet in a way that had texture and weight. "What the hell is this?" he said. Quiet, deadly quiet. She reached for the fabric. He caught her wrist. Not hard, but certain. "Who did that to you?" Her throat closed. The answer was in her chest like something calcified. Years of wait, years of silence, years of learning that the truth had a cost she could not afford. She felt the shape of it behind her ribs. "Please don't ask me that," she whispered. Serafina. The way he said her name, she didn't know how to describe it. Not soft, not demanding, just present. Just a sound that meant I'm here and I'm not leaving and you can stop carrying this alone. She felt something crack open. "My father," she said. The words came out barely above a breath, but they landed in the room like a detonation. Damien's hands, still wrapped around her wrist, became very, very still. And in the silence that followed, in the gray-lit November room 40 stories above the harbor, Serafina Vale watched something change in the face of the man she had married in terror. Watched the stillness harden into something that was no longer restraint, no longer patience, no longer the careful management of a man who had chosen discipline over destruction. And she understood, in the cold clarity of that moment, that she had just told the most dangerous man in the city the one thing that would make him impossible to stop. Damien didn't move for a long time. He was still crouched in front of her, still holding her wrist in that careful grip that was somehow simultaneously the gentlest and most dangerous thing she had ever felt. And the wound in his side was still bleeding through the compressed cloth she'd pressed against it, and none of that seemed to matter to him anymore. He was looking at her back, at the architecture of damage that her father had spent 20 years constructing on her skin. She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the fabric. "Look at me," he said. She didn't want to. Looking at him right now meant seeing whatever was happening in his face, and she'd spent her whole life learning to read rooms by peripheral vision and sound and the specific quality of silence, and the silence in this room had a shape she recognized and feared. She'd heard that silence before, in her father's study, in the hallway outside her bedroom door, and in the back seat of cars driven by men who worked for people who wanted things from her. But this was different. She looked at him. His face was a controlled demolition. Whatever was happening behind those gray eyes was enormous, and it was restrained, held back by a structure of will that she could almost see the seams of. And the restraint itself was more frightening than the rage would have been, because rage she knew how to navigate. Rage had a pattern. This was something else, something cold and methodical and permanent. "How long?" he said. Not what happened, not are you okay, just the most essential question, stripped to bone. "I don't remember a time before it," she said. The seams showed. Just for a second, a single second where his jaw tightened and something moved across his face like a weather system, massive and fast. And then it was gone and the stillness was back. But she'd seen it. She'd have to think about what she'd seen later, when she had the capacity to think about anything at all. He released her wrists slowly. He stood. She watched him walk to the window and stand with his back to her, and she watched his hands open and close at his sides once, twice, and then go still. Outside, the harbor lights smeared across rain-wet glass. The city below had no idea. The city below was doing what cities did, eating, sleeping, conducting its small transactions of love and cruelty without knowledge of the 40-story room above it, where two people who barely knew each other were renegotiating the terms of everything. "I need you to tell me what happened at the bridge," she said finally. Because she needed to bring them back to something manageable, something that had a task embedded in it. He was bleeding. That was still real. He didn't turn around. "It was handled." "You're still losing blood." "I said it was handled." "Damien." His name felt strange in her mouth. She'd barely used it in 3 weeks. "Let me finish what I started, or that wound is going to need more than I can do here." A pause. He turned from the window and walked back to the kitchen table and sat down without another word, and she understood that this was the closest he was capable of coming to compliance. She picked up the cloth and the kit Mara had shown her 2 weeks ago. She'd wondered at the time why Mara had shown her, and understood now that Mara showed her things with purpose, and she worked on the wound in silence with hands that had mostly stopped shaking. He watched her face while she worked. She felt it, but didn't look up. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "We've been married 3 weeks. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She pressed a closure strip flat and smoothed it with her thumb. "I don't know you. I didn't know what you'd do with it." "And now?" She finally looked up. "And now it's too late to choose differently," she said. "So here we are." He held her gaze. "Here we are," he agreed. She taped the last closure and sat back and looked at her own hands in her lap and thought, "You just handed a man who buries people alive a reason to bury your father." She thought about whether she had feelings about that. She examined the place where the feeling should have been and found something complicated and unresolved that she didn't have the language for yet. Damien picked up his phone off the table. "Not tonight," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're about to do," she said. "Not tonight. Please." His thumb hovered over the screen. She met his eyes and held them, which cost her something, and he saw it cost her, and she watched him weigh things she couldn't fully see. He set the phone face down on the table. "Tonight," he said. She breathed. "Thank you." He said nothing, but he stayed at the table while she cleaned up the kit, and he didn't pick the phone up again, and eventually Mara appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of someone who'd assessed a situation from just outside it and was choosing not to comment. And Serafina excused herself and went to her room and sat in the window seat for a long time, watching the rain and turning the ring on her finger and thinking about the specific weight of things that couldn't be unsaid. He made the calls in the morning. She heard the cadence of it through the wall. Not the words, just the rhythm. 4 calls before 7 a.m., each shorter than the last, each in that flat decisive register she now recognized as Damien in operational mode. The mode where he was solving a problem, and the problem had a body count attached, and neither of those facts required comment. She dressed and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the counter with both hands around the mug and waited. He came in at 7:15. His face was composed. Whatever he'd set in motion with those calls, the decision had been made and he wasn't going to revisit it. She recognized that state too. The afterside of a terrible choice, when the weight lifted not because it was gone, but because it had been distributed into action. "What did you do?" she said. "Research." He poured coffee. "Nothing else yet?" "Yet." He looked at her over the rim of his mug. "I need information before I move. That's how this works." "That's how all of it works with you, isn't it?" She kept her voice level. "You gather first, you decide. Then you act and it's done and no one can argue because the decision's already been executed. It's kept me alive. It kept you functional," she said. "That's not the same thing." He set his mug down. She felt the shift in the room and wondered if she'd gone too far, and then decided she was done calibrating her honesty to the comfort levels of men, regardless of who they were. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "Tell me specifically. What outcome do you want from this?" "I want you to tell me what you found before you decide anything." He studied her. "And if you don't like what I found, then I need to know that too." He was quiet for a moment. The rain had stopped overnight and the city was gray and washed outside the window, and the morning light was the color of unfinished things. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing. She thought it was unconscious, the way he always stood when he was controlling something, the way height was its own form of management. And he told her what 3 phone calls and a network of people who owed him things had produced in 12 hours. It was worse than she'd known. She'd known about the beatings, of course. She'd lived them. But she hadn't known about the documentation, the files her father had constructed over the years to discredit her in advance. Medical records from a doctor on Lucien's payroll diagnosing her with a psychiatric condition at age 15. Emails between her father and 2 of his senior advisors describing her as unstable and a liability, and in one thread from 2 years ago, discussing the disposal problem in language that could have meant many things, and in context meant only one. She sat with that for a long moment. Disposal problem. "He wanted you to kill me," she said. Damien's expression didn't change. "The marriage was designed to end one way. He thought you'd get rid of me eventually. Take whatever he was offering, and then remove the witness." "Yes." She put her coffee mug down because her hands had gone strange. Not trembling, just distant, disconnected from her body, which was a sensation she recognized from very bad nights in her father's house. "What was he offering?" she said. "Access, connections. 12 senators, 4 federal judges, the commissioner of the Harbor Authority." He paused. "And a real estate portfolio that would have given me legitimate cover for most of my operations for the next decade. He sold me for real estate. He sold you for political infrastructure." Damien sat down across from her, which was unusual. He almost never chose to sit. The real estate was incidental. She looked at the table surface. There was a scratch in the wood near the edge, something small and old, and she focused on it with the same precision she'd focused on tiles and stairs and clock faces throughout her life. "My entire life," she said, "I have been inside the calculation." "Yes." "And the calculation was always—" She stopped, restarted. "He never once made a decision that factored me in as a person." "No?" "Just as a variable." "Yes." She looked up. "What are you going to do?" Damien held her gaze. "What I do with people who hurt mine." The word mine landed in a complicated place. Not possessive, or not only possessive, something with more dimensions than ownership. "I'm not asking you to destroy him for me," she said. "I know. I'm asking you, Paul." She stopped again. What was she asking? She was asking him not to become something worse in the process. She was asking him to stay legible to her because she'd built a fragile architecture of trust around the man who had said no one enters without your permission, and she did not have the reserves to start over. She was asking him something she didn't have words for yet. "I need you to be careful," she said, "about what this does to you." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not what I expected you to say." "What did you expect?" "Stop." He said it flatly. "Or let me handle it my way." That's usually what people say. I'm not people, she said, and I'm not asking you to stop. He sat with that. Then what? I'm asking you to still be recognizable when it's over. Mara found her in the supply closet an hour later. Serafina was standing in front of the shelves, not taking anything, just standing in the small contained space with the door mostly closed and the light off, which was something she had done as a child in the linen cupboard on the second floor of her father's house, the only space in that building where the air didn't carry the anticipation of consequences. Mara didn't comment. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and waited. "How long have you worked for him?" Serafina asked. 11 years. Since before. Since before most things, Mara said. Serafina turned around. In the dim light from the hallway, she could see Mara's face clearly. The economy of it, the way she'd trained herself to offer information in controlled portions. Another person who had learned to live inside someone else's operational framework. "Is he going to be all right?" Serafina said. Mara was quiet for a moment. "He's never gone to war for a personal reason before," she said finally. "Every other time it's been strategic, business, enforcement." She paused. "This is different." "Different how?" "Different like I've seen him in a room with men who owed him money and watched him make decisions in 30 seconds that would take most people a week to justify." Mara met her gaze. "I've never seen him hesitate. He hesitated last night because of what you asked him." "That should be a good thing." "It is," Mara said. "It's also a vulnerability. And the people who want him dead are currently trying to figure out where his vulnerabilities are." Serafina processed that. "They'll figure it out," she said. "They will." "When?" Mara looked at her with something that might have been apology if Mara had been the type. "It's already started." She found out what started meant the following afternoon. Damien was in a meeting she wasn't included in. She'd learned to recognize the particular density of bodies and low voices that meant this floor is not for you right now. And she was in her room working when she heard raised voices from the level below. Not raised like anger, raised like urgency, which was different and worse. She went to the door and opened it. Mara was in the hallway, moving fast. "Stay in your room," Mara said without slowing. "What happened?" "Room, now." Serafina watched her go and then went back inside and stood at the window and watched the harbor and waited with her heartbeat doing its old familiar inventory of possibilities, cataloging threats the way it had learned to do in the house where she grew up, running assessments of which doors led where and which windows could be opened from the inside. 12 minutes later, Damien appeared in her doorway. He was in his jacket. He had his phone in one hand. His face was the controlled demolition again, but closer to the surface this time. "Your father called a press conference," he said. She turned from the window. 2 hours ago, Damien continued, he announced a federal investigation into organized crime activity in the Harbor District. He named me specifically. He paused. He also announced that his daughter had been coerced into a fraudulent marriage under duress, and that he intends to pursue annulment and criminal charges on her behalf. The room was quiet. Serafina heard her own breathing, in and out, even, the way she'd trained it. "He's using me as the shield," she said. "He's making himself the victim's father," Damien said. "It puts him in front of the investigation. It makes any action I take against him look like retaliation against someone protecting a vulnerable woman." "Brilliant," she said, and she hated that it was. She hated that her father's mind worked in a way she could admire even while it was being used to dismantle her. "There's more," Damien said. She braced. "He's claiming you've been isolated, that you have no access to outside communication, that you've shown signs of psychological deterioration consistent with captivity." He held her gaze. "He has a doctor on record." "The same doctor he paid to diagnose me at 15. "Yes." She sat down on the edge of the window seat. "So anything I say contradicting him becomes evidence of the deterioration," she said. "If I say I'm fine, that's what a woman in captivity says. If I show distress, that confirms his narrative. The frame closes on both sides. You understand how this works. I grew up watching him build frames around people." She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. "He did it to my mother. He did it to his first chief of staff. He's been doing it to me my whole life. I just never watched him do it from the outside before." Damien was quiet. "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question surprised her. The genuine quality of it, not a briefing, not a notification, but an actual opening toward her decision. "What are my options?" she said. "You can speak publicly, counter his narrative directly. It creates risk because it puts your face on this and makes you a target for every faction that wants leverage over me. And the alternative? We move quietly. I handle the investigation through channels. It takes longer, and your father controls the story in the meantime." She looked at him. "You said we." He didn't flinch from it. "I did." She sat with that word. 3 letters. The most complicated architecture she'd encountered in 30 years of living inside other people's plans. "There's a third option," she said. "Tell me." "I talked to the federal investigator directly. Not publicly, not through your channels. I request a private meeting on my own terms, and I tell them what I know about my father's network." She watched his face. "I've been inside that house for 20 years. I know names, accounts, locations, things he was never careful enough to hide from someone he considered furniture." The silence that followed was a different quality from before. "That puts you in federal protection," Damien said, "which means you leave here." "Yes. It also means your testimony becomes the foundation for the case," he said. "You become the most important witness in a federal investigation into organized crime and political corruption." "I know. They'll use you." "Everyone uses me," she said quietly. "At least this time I choose it." He studied her face for a long time. She held very still under it. "There's something you haven't considered," he said. "Tell me." "Your father anticipated this possibility." He moved to the window and stood beside her, not touching, looking out at the harbor where the gray water caught the failing afternoon light. "The files I accessed this morning, there are communications between Lucian and the lead investigator on the federal case." She felt it before he finished saying it. "He already owns him," she said, "since 2 years ago, before the investigation was even opened." Damien turned to look at her. "Your father didn't react to the investigation. He built it. It was designed from the beginning as a mechanism, a way to move against me when he needed to, using federal apparatus he already controlled." The scale of it settled into her chest like cold water. "He built the investigation against you as an exit strategy," she said, "in case the marriage didn't end the way he planned. In case I became a problem rather than a solution. Which you became the moment you—" She stopped. "The moment I didn't kill you," Damien said. She looked at him. "He's been watching," she said. "He's been watching since the ceremony. He saw you give me the room, the lock, the—" She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. "He saw us at the window that night. Probably. He knew before I did," she said, "that something was changing." Damien's jaw tightened. "He's not patient," Serafina said. "He moves when he's afraid. That press conference today wasn't strategy. It was panic. He's scared of what you'll do now that you know." "He should be." "Which means he's not going to wait," she said. "Whatever he's planning next, the investigation, the charges, whatever else, it's already in motion. Today wasn't the announcement. It was the trigger." The word landed in the room and sat there. Damien picked up his phone. This time she didn't ask him to wait. She watched him make the call. 4 words in a low, flat voice, a name and a location and a time frame, the kind of call that sounded like logistics and was. And she watched his face while he made it and thought about what she'd said to him the night before. "I'm asking you to still be recognizable when it's over." She thought about whether she had the right to ask that, whether recognizable was something either of them would be on the other side of whatever this had already become. She thought about her father in a room somewhere building frames around them both, moving his pieces across a board he'd designed, confident in the outcome because he had always been confident in outcomes, and the outcomes had always, eventually, arranged themselves to his satisfaction. She thought about 20 years of being arranged. "I need to tell you something," she said when Damien set the phone down. He looked at her. "My father has a contingency," she said. "I don't know all of it, but I know he has a safe deposit facility registered under my name. I found the documentation when I was 19, and I didn't understand what it was then." She paused. "I understand it now. Whatever's in that facility, whatever leverage he was preserving as a last option, it's registered to me, which means if anything happens to him, I'm implicated by default. Damien was completely still. You've been carrying that, he said, for 11 years. Why didn't you? Because I didn't know who to tell, she said. Because every person I might have told was either his or afraid of him. Because knowing and surviving sometimes means knowing alone. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you now. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her and looked at her face with that thorough attention that missed nothing. And she held herself very still and let him look, which was the hardest thing she'd learned to do and the most important. And after a long moment, he reached out and put one hand against the side of her face, just held it there, warm and careful, and she did not flinch. She almost did. She caught it, the old reflex, the instinct that had been trained into her over years of proximity to hands that meant harm. Caught it and held it and stayed still. And he felt the almost of it in the slight tension of her jaw, and his thumb moved once across her cheekbone in a gesture that was neither ownership nor performance, but something that belonged to an entirely different vocabulary. We're going to end this, he said. She covered his hand with hers. Outside, the harbor darkened into evening, and somewhere in the city, Lucien Vale was activating contingencies, and somewhere in the federal apparatus, his owned investigator was moving pieces, and Damien's phone was already beginning to buzz with the specific frequency of bad news arriving faster than expected, and neither of them reached for it yet, just stood in the gray light of the residential level with their hands overlapping and the weight of everything unfinished pressing down from all directions. The phone buzzed again. And again. Damien looked at the screen. She watched his face change, not the controlled demolition this time, something quicker and harder than that. What? She said. He turned the phone so she could read it. 3 words from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words that landed in her chest like 3 words. They have Mara. Serafina read them twice. Her brain performed the translation with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime processing bad news in real time, absorbing it, filing it, continuing to function. And then the translation finished, and the implications opened beneath her like a floor giving way. Mara, who had shown her the medical kit, who had left the donation files where she could find them, who had stood in the doorway of a dark supply closet 11 years into working for the most dangerous man in the city and waited without comment while a traumatized woman stood in the dark and breathed. When? Damien said. He was already moving, jacket on, phone to his ear, the transition from stillness to action so fast it had no visible seam. She watched him cross the room and felt the air change quality around him, felt the thing that made rooms quiet when he entered them shift into a different register entirely. 40 minutes ago, said the voice on the phone. She could hear it from where she stood. Parking structure on Aldrin. They took her car and left her phone. We have footage. Who? A pause. That's the problem. Damien stopped walking. Tell me. The plates on the vehicle trace back to a holding company. Another pause, shorter. The holding company is registered to the same attorney who filed the federal complaint this morning on Senator Vale's behalf. The room was completely silent. Serafina understood what that meant before Damien said anything. Mara wasn't taken by her father's private muscle. The contracted security and political fixers she'd grown up watching operate from the background of her father's world. Mara was taken by people working inside a federal framework. People with access to surveillance systems and legal infrastructure, and the ability to make a person disappear into a process rather than a grave, which was in some ways worse because graves had locations. Lockdown, Damien said into the phone. Full. Everyone inside, no movement until I say. He ended the call. He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him. He escalated, she said. He escalated because he's afraid. Taking Mara is a message. It's leverage. Damien set the phone on the table. His voice had dropped to the register she'd only heard once before, the night of the assassination attempt, when he'd been bleeding and furious and still in complete control of every word. He wants me to move. He wants me to react visibly and aggressively so the federal narrative has supporting evidence. If you go after Mara, I become exactly what the investigation claims. And if you don't, Mara is in federal custody as a material witness, he said. which means she is accessible to people who work for your father, which means she is not safe. Serafina pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at the surface of it in thought. Not about her feelings, not about the fear that had started a slow cold crawl up her spine the moment she'd read those 3 words. About the structure of what her father had built and where its load-bearing elements were. He needs Mara to say something specific, she said. Damien looked at her. That's why he took her. Not to hurt her. Not yet. She looked up. He needs a statement. Something that confirms his narrative about me, about the coercion, the isolation, the captivity. Mara has been with me every day for 6 weeks. If he can get her on record saying she witnessed my deterioration, my fear, my inability to move freely, it closes the frame. It closes the frame, she said, and then the annulment moves forward on his terms. The federal investigation has a cooperating witness, and he controls the story completely. Damien was very still. Mara won't give him that, he said. No, Serafina agreed, which means he'll find another way to get what he needs from her. And the longer she's in that custody, the more options he has. She watched him process this, watched the calculations move behind his eyes. Not cold, not purely strategic, because Mara was 11 years and a loyalty that ran in both directions. And even men who built their lives on controlled distance had things they could not afford to lose. There's something else, he said. She waited. The facility, he said. The safe deposit account registered in your name. He held her gaze. My people accessed the registry records 20 minutes ago. And it was opened 6 months before your mother died. The words landed in a specific place, a place she had kept sealed for a long time. That's not possible, she said. I was 14 when my mother died. The account was opened in your name by a legal proxy with power of attorney, Damien said. Signed by your mother, 6 months before her death. Her mother, Eleanor Vale, who had died of a cardiac event at 41 while her husband was in the middle of a re-election campaign. Eleanor, who had been beautiful and quiet, and had looked at Serafina sometimes across dinner tables with an expression her daughter hadn't understood until she was old enough to recognize it as recognition. I see what's happening to you. I can't stop it. I'm sorry. My mother opened that account, Serafina said slowly, under your name, with documentation that predates her death by 6 months, which suggests she knew she was going to die. The room tilted slightly. She grabbed the edge of the table. Not from grief. The grief was old and calcified and no longer had sharp edges. From the sudden disorienting weight of a truth arriving 20 years late, enormous and irreversible and changing the shape of everything she'd believed about her own history. She was building me an exit, Serafina said. Yes. She knew what he was. She knew what he was going to do to me. Yes. And she couldn't. She stopped, restarted. She couldn't get me out directly, so she built a back door. She registered an account in my name so that whatever he put in there for his own protection would eventually become mine. She pressed one hand over her mouth for a moment. She was smarter than he knew. Much smarter, Damien said. Which means what's in that account is yours by legal standing, he said. And based on the transaction records my people pulled, what's in that account is not real estate documentation. He paused. It's 20 years of correspondence, digital files, recorded conversations, financial records connecting your father's corruption network to 17 individuals currently holding federal positions. Serafina understood. She sat very still and let the understanding move through her completely. Her mother had spent the last months of her life building a weapon. Not for herself. She'd known she wasn't going to survive long enough to use it, or had suspected, or had been afraid and prepared anyway, the way frightened people sometimes prepared because the preparing was the only thing left that felt like agency. She'd built it for her daughter and hidden it in plain sight under Serafina's name, where Lucien would never look because he'd never once considered that Serafina could be a threat. He'd considered her furniture. Furniture didn't fight back. He doesn't know about the contents, Serafina said. No, he knows the account exists because he's been using it as a liability. He thinks whatever's in there is his documentation, his insurance. He doesn't know your mother replaced it. When did she replace it? 3 weeks before she died. Serafina closed her eyes for just a moment. just long enough to acknowledge the size of what her mother had done, alone, frightened, running out of time, doing the last thing she could do for the child she couldn't save by any other means. Then she opened her eyes. "We need to access it," she said. "Yes. But if we move on the facility now, your father will know," Damien said. "He has the building under surveillance. Any approach we make gets flagged." "Then we need him looking somewhere else." Damien looked at her carefully. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I need to talk to the press." She'd expected him to argue. He didn't. He looked at her for a long moment with that assessment that missed nothing, and then he nodded once, which she'd learned was the most significant form of agreement available from him. And then he called someone named Callum, and within 40 minutes, a woman named Dr. Renata Voss arrived at the Black Cathedral's service entrance with a recording kit and the particular composure of someone who handled volatile situations professionally. Serafina didn't know who Dr. Voss was. She didn't ask. She sat across from her at the kitchen table and answered questions for 90 minutes with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this conversation her entire life without knowing it. She talked about the beatings, the isolation, the doctor at 15, the way her father had constructed her public identity while systematically destroying her private one. She talked about the marriage, the genuine coercion of it, her father's intent, what she'd learned since, and she talked about the press conference and what it meant for her to have her victimhood weaponized by the same person who had created it. She didn't cry. She had cried at 17 in a bathroom for 3 hours over something her father had done and made a decision afterward that she was done performing distress for people who were trying to use it. What she offered instead was specificity, dates, details, the particular texture of memory that couldn't be manufactured. Dr. Voss recorded everything without interruption. When it was done, Serafina sat back in the chair and felt emptied in a way that wasn't entirely bad, like something had been carried at a specific weight for a long time and been set down, and the muscles were still shaped around the absence. "This is going to create a significant response," Dr. Voss said. "I know. From your father specifically." "That's the point," Serafina said. She caught Damien in the hallway afterward. He was on the phone again, always on the phone, always the low, flat voice. And he ended the call when he saw her face. "It's done," she said. "It goes public at 6 a.m., he said. "By 6:15, Lucien's people will be managing the fallout. And in that window, we move on the facility," he said. "Yes." She nodded. "Get some sleep," he said. She almost laughed. Instead, she walked back to her room and sat in the window seat and watched the harbor go from black to deep blue to the gray of pre-dawn. And she did not sleep. And she thought about her mother in a room 20 years ago doing the only thing she had left to do. And she thought about how love sometimes expressed itself as the most extraordinary practical act. And she thought about the specific cost of being born into the wrong family and surviving it anyway. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, she fell asleep sitting up against the cold glass and dreamed about nothing at all. The story broke at 6:02. By 6:20, 3 major outlets had picked it up. By 6:40, Lucien Vale's press secretary had released a statement calling the account fabricated and expressing concern for his daughter's mental health, which was so precisely the wrong response that Serafina, reading it on Damien's phone in the back seat of an armored car moving through pre-dawn traffic, almost felt something like satisfaction. Almost. "He's pulling his people back from the federal building," said the man in the front passenger seat. One of Damien's, name unknown to her, face professionally blank. "Redirecting to the communications team." "How long does that give us?" Damien said. "Maybe 2 hours before he figures out it's a diversion." Damien looked at Serafina. She looked back at him. 2 hours. The facility was a mid-rise commercial building in the financial district, the kind of building designed to be invisible, no signage, a service front that looked like a dozen other service fronts. They entered through a side access that Damien's advance team had already cleared, and she walked through familiar security procedures with unfamiliar hands guiding her forward, and tried not to think about the fact that she was walking into a space that carried her name and her mother's last act simultaneously. The deposit vault was on the 4th floor. Her biometrics opened it, eye scan, and a handprint registered 2 decades ago and never revoked because her father had never imagined a scenario where this became a problem. The vault was smaller than she'd expected, a single reinforced drawer, roughly the size of a shoebox. She pulled it open. A drive. 3 physical folders. A sealed envelope with her name on it in handwriting she recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists, and the backs of photographs, or her mother's handwriting, careful and slightly left-leaning, preserved perfectly. She picked up the envelope. Her name. Just that. Serafina. In her mother's hand. She did not open it here. She put it in her jacket pocket against her ribs where she could feel the slight pressure of it, and she picked up the drive and the folders and put them in the bag Damien's man held open, and she did not let herself think about anything except the next step. "We're clear," Damien said quietly beside her. She nodded. They were not clear. She understood that 3 minutes later, on the way back to the elevator, when the advance man's earpiece crackled with something that made him stop moving and put his hand up. Everyone stopped. "Talk to me," Damien said. "Building security just went offline," the advance man said. "All 4 cameras on this floor, simultaneously." Damien turned. She turned with him. At the far end of the corridor, 2 men in dark suits appeared from the stairwell door. Not her father's contracted security. She knew that profile, had grown up watching those men move. These were different. Younger, more technically precise in their positioning, wearing the specific kind of unremarkable that only came from training. Federal. "Don't move," said the one on the left. He had a badge out. "Ms. Vale, you need to come with us." "This is a voluntary access of a legally registered personal account," Damien said. His voice was its flattest, most controlled register, the one that cost him the most to maintain. "This facility is currently under federal seal as part of an active investigation," said the agent. "The contents of account 7741-5 have been designated as evidence." "That account is registered in my name," Serafina said. "Registered to a minor, under proxy authorization," the agent said. "The originating authority has been questioned and the registration is under review." Her mother. They were challenging her mother's proxy authority. 20 years after her mother's death, Lucian Vale had found a way to reach back and undo the last thing Eleanor Vale had done for her daughter. Serafina felt something move through her that wasn't fear. It was adjacent to fear, below it, heavier. The particular weight of a person who has been outmaneuvered at the most fundamental level, not just strategically, not just in terms of plan and counterplan, but genealogically. Her father had found a way to weaponize her own origin. "We're leaving," Damien said. "Sir." "You do not have a warrant for her person," Damien said. "You have a facility seal which applies to the contents of the vault. The contents are subject to legal dispute which will be resolved through counsel. We are leaving." The agents looked at each other. The calculation was visible. They hadn't expected this particular pushback in this particular form. They'd expected either compliance or aggression, and Damien was offering neither. He was offering the most dangerous thing possible, precision. They stepped aside. She walked past them with the bag over her shoulder and her heartbeat doing its inventory, and Damien's hand briefly at the small of her back. Not gripping, just present, a degree of pressure that meant, "I'm here, keep moving." And they took the elevator down in silence and got back into the armored car, and the doors closed. "They'll report it," Damien said. "I know. Well, your father will know we accessed it." "He'll know the bag exists," she said. "He doesn't know what's in it." She pressed her hand against her ribs where the envelope sat. "He thinks he replaced her documentation with his. He doesn't know my mother replaced it back." The car moved through the financial district toward the harbor. Damien was on the phone again. She could hear fragments, the name Callum again, and the name of a firm she didn't recognize, and the words chain of custody and proxy validity challenge, and the specific, precise vocabulary of a man who had learned to fight in every arena simultaneously. She looked out the window. The city was awake and moving and indifferent, the way cities always were, the way she'd found both desolating and grounding at various points in her life. Coffee carts and delivery vehicles and people going toward things without the knowledge of what was happening 40 stories above them, or in armored cars, or in the specific silent violence of a war being fought through legal architecture. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number, text message. I know you have the drive. You have 6 hours to return it before I release the secondary file. You know what's in it. Elle, she stared at the screen. Secondary file. She did not know what was in it. She thought she knew everything. She thought she'd found the shape of her father's strategy and understood its dimensions and found the place where her mother had hidden the countermeasure inside it. She'd thought the timeline made sense. The vault, the drive, the 20-year-old trap that had finally become a weapon. Secondary file. Damien, she said. He looked at her. She handed him the phone. He read it. His face didn't change, but she saw his eyes move over the message twice, and the second time she watched something adjust in his expression. A recalibration she'd never seen before. The subtle shift of a man encountering a variable he hadn't accounted for. Secondary file, he said. I don't know what it is. He's telling you that you don't have everything. His voice was careful. That there's something in his possession that he's holding separately. Something he believes will neutralize what's on the drive. Or implicate me, she said, because that was the other architecture. Not just neutralize, but invert. Make her the threat rather than the witness. What could he have? Damien said. It wasn't rhetorical. He was asking her to inventory. She thought about every room she'd ever been in, every conversation she'd ever been adjacent to, every piece of information that existed about her that her father could hold, shape, present, in a frame designed to destroy her. And then she thought about something else, something she'd almost forgotten, because she'd worked very hard to forget it. A night 5 years ago, a private event at her father's estate, a man who'd been too persistent, and a room she'd been cornered in, and what had happened in that room before a member of her father's security staff pulled the man out, and her father had appeared in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she'd read at the time as concern, and understood now, with the cold clarity of everything she'd learned in the past 6 weeks, was something entirely different. Her father had been there. He'd been there and he'd waited. Not long enough for serious harm, but long enough, precisely long enough. And there were cameras in that room because there were cameras in every room in her father's house. And he had the footage. And the footage, absent context, absent the before and after, would show his daughter in a compromising position with a man who currently held a federal appointment. It would destroy her testimony. It would destroy her credibility. It would turn her from a witness into a liability. He has footage from the estate, she said. Her voice came out flat and cold and strange to her own ears. From 5 years ago, there was an incident, She stopped, organized herself. A man, my father's associate. He cornered me. My father has the footage, and without context, it looks like something it wasn't. Damien was completely still. How long have you known about the footage? He said. I didn't know he had it. I suspected. I didn't let myself... She stopped again. I didn't let myself follow the thought because the answer was too... Serafina. She looked at him. He's been holding that for 5 years, Damien said. Yes. For exactly this moment. Yes. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. He never does anything with a single purpose. Everything doubles. The marriage was both a trade and a disposal. The investigation was both a weapon against you and a frame around me. The footage was both leverage to keep me compliant and insurance against exactly this. She gestured at the bag, the drive, everything. Exactly this situation where I stopped being compliant. The car was slowing toward the harbor. So if he releases that footage, Damien said. My testimony is worthless, she said. Worse than worthless. He'll build a narrative around it. His troubled daughter, her history of instability, the fabricated account she gave under the influence of a man who isolated and manipulated her. She heard her own voice fraying at the edges and stopped it. Breathed through her nose, continued. Everything I said this morning becomes evidence of deterioration rather than truth. The car stopped. Outside the armored glass, the harbor was gray and enormous and indifferent. 6 hours. She had 6 hours before her father released the footage, and every word she'd spoken into Dr. Voss's recorder became ammunition against her. She turned to look at Damien and found him already looking at her, and the expression on his face was unlike anything she'd cataloged from him in 6 weeks of studying his face with the attention of someone whose survival had always depended on reading the room correctly. It wasn't rage. It wasn't calculation. It was the particular expression of a man who has identified something he cannot fix and is standing in the gap anyway. "Tell me what you need," he said. She opened her mouth. And then the driver's voice came through the partition, very quietly, with the specific evenness of a man delivering information he knew was going to change the temperature of the vehicle. "Sir, the federal team from the facility. They didn't file a report." Damien turned. "What do you mean they didn't file a report?" "There's no record of the intercept in any federal system. The agents who approached you in that building, their badge numbers don't correspond to any active personnel in the investigations task force." A pause. "They weren't federal agents." The silence in the car had a new quality. "They were your father's people," Damien said quietly. Not to Serafina, to himself. "Performing federal authority," she said, "to find out if you had the drive." He turned back to her, and now the expression was the one she recognized, cold and precise and already 3 steps ahead. "They weren't there to stop you from taking it. They were there to confirm you had it." "So he knows." "He knew before you got back in the car." She sat with that. 6 hours. A drive that was now confirmed in her possession. Footage that could destroy her testimony. A woman named Mara somewhere in a building her father controlled, being asked to say things that weren't true by people who had the resources to make not saying very uncomfortable. And somewhere below all of it, in the bottom register of everything she'd learned and survived and built and broken and rebuilt across 30 years of living inside the wrong family, something that felt like the last remaining wall coming down. She reached into the bag. She took out the drive. She turned it over in her hands. 20 years of her mother's work. 20 years of carefully assembled evidence, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a daughter who hadn't known it existed, built by a woman who'd understood that the only way out was through and had not lived long enough to take it herself. Serafina looked at Damien. "I know what we have to do," she said. "Tell me." "We can't run from the footage," she said. "He'll release it regardless of what we do with the drive. The footage exists and it will be used, and there's nothing that makes it not exist." She paused. "So we don't try to stop the release." Damien waited. "We release the drive first," she said. "Everything on it. Not to one outlet, not to one investigator. To everyone, simultaneously, before he can build the frame. We flood the zone with my mother's documentation so completely that by the time his footage surfaces, the context is already established." She looked at him. "My mother built a weapon. I need to fire it before he can take it out of my hands." The harbor outside was gray and flat and enormous. Damien looked at her for a long moment. "If we do this," he said, "there is no version of the next 24 hours that doesn't become completely unpredictable. I know. People will move against us from every direction. I know. Mara is still—" "I know," she said. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and she let it. "I know. And I'm telling you we do it anyway, because my father has spent 20 years building a world where I have no good options, and I am done waiting for a good option to appear." She held the drive in both hands. "This is the option we have. This is the one my mother left us." Damien looked at the drive in her hands. Then he looked at her face. Then he picked up his phone and called Callum and said, "We're accelerating. Prepare the distribution protocol. Everything goes out at once." A pause. "Yes, now." He ended the call. He looked at her. 6 hours, she said. "Less," he said. "Once this starts, your father will know within the first 20 minutes. He'll release the footage immediately and move everything else he has. Then we need Mara out before that." "Working on it." "Damien." She waited until he held her gaze. "If something goes wrong, nothing's going to—" "If something goes wrong," she said again, steadier. "The envelope in my pocket is addressed to me, but it's not for me. My mother wrote it for whoever ended up standing here. I need you to read it if I can't." She reached into her jacket and held it out to him. She was smarter than both of us. Whatever she wrote, it matters. He took the envelope. He held it carefully, the way he'd held her charcoal drawing of him weeks ago, like something that deserved to be handled without damage. "Nothing's going to go wrong," he said. She almost believed him. And then his phone rang with a number she recognized. Her father's private line, the one she'd memorized as a child the way children memorize things they feared. The one that had called her to account in 100 different rooms over 2 decades of being managed and corrected and erased. And the sound of it in this car, in this morning, with the drive in her hands and the harbor outside, and the weight of everything already in motion pressing down from every direction, felt like... Damien answered on the second ring. He put it on speaker without being asked, which she understood was for her, so she could hear, so she wasn't managed out of the room the way she'd been managed out of every room her entire life. She looked at the phone in his hand and breathed through her nose and waited. "You've been busy." Her father's voice filled the armored car like something that had always been there, smooth, measured, the particular cadence of a man who was accustomed to being the most controlled person in any conversation. "I'm impressed, Serafina. Genuinely." She said nothing. "The interview was a nice touch," Lucian continued. "Very sympathetic. You've always photographed well, your mother's bone structure. Pity about the rest." A pause, precisely timed. "I assume Damien is listening." "I'm here," Damien said. "Good. Then I'll be direct." The voice shifted, not harder, just more efficient, the way a surgeon's voice shifted when moving from consultation to procedure. "You have something of mine, I have something of yours. This is a simple exchange and everyone walks away functional." "Mara," Damien said, "she's comfortable. She'll remain comfortable as long as this conversation stays productive." "Release her now," Damien said. "Then we talk." "That's not how exchanges work, and you know that." A brief pause. "The drive, Damien, everything on it. Physical and digital copies, witness destruction, confirmed by my attorney within the hour. In exchange, Mara goes home. The footage stays private. The federal complaint is quietly restructured to remove Serafina's name. And you and I return to the arrangement we originally discussed before sentiment complicated things." Serafina looked at the harbor through the glass. Gray water, gray sky, the city going about its morning. "And Serafina," Damien said. Not a question. "My daughter returns to my care during the annulment proceedings," Lucian said. "Standard protocol. No contact during the legal process. I'm sure you understand." The car was very quiet. She felt Damien look at her. She didn't look back. She was looking at her father's voice coming out of a small speaker in an armored car by the harbor, and thinking about 20 years of being inside that voice, living at its frequency, calibrating every response to its shifts and temperatures. "No," she said. A pause. "Serafina." "No," she said again, cleaner. "You don't get to offer me as a term of your own negotiation. I'm not a term, I'm not collateral, I'm not going back." "I'm going to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised her, coming up from somewhere below fear, below the old reflexes, from whatever was left after you stripped away everything that had been trained into you by someone else. "You built a weapon in my name, and you forgot that weapons can be turned around. My mother understood that. She was smarter than you gave her credit for. She was smarter than you gave either of us credit for." The silence on the line had a texture. "What did you say?" Lucian said. Very quiet. "She left me everything," Serafina said. 20 years of documentation, recorded conversations, financial transfers, the names of every federal official you own, every judge, every commissioner, every person you've paid to stay silent or paid to look the right direction. All of it, organized and preserved and waiting in an account you thought was yours." She paused. "She replaced your files 3 weeks before she died. You've been protecting a vault full of evidence against yourself for 20 years, and you didn't know it." The silence stretched. Then something happened in her father's voice she had never heard in 30 years. A crack. Small. Immediately controlled. But real. "You're bluffing," he said. "Release Mara," Damien said, "in the next 10 minutes, or the drive goes public." "If you do that, the footage won't save you," Serafina said. "Release whatever you have. It won't change what my mother documented. It won't change what I said this morning. The only thing it does is add your name to the list of things people are angry about." She pressed the drive between both palms. You built my entire life around the idea that I had no options. You were wrong. You were wrong about me, and you were wrong about her. And I think somewhere underneath all of it, you've known that for a long time, and it terrifies you." The line was silent for 4 seconds. 10 minutes, Damien said, and ended the call. He looked at her. She was shaking. Not from fear, from the specific adrenaline of having said the thing, the true thing, the thing that had lived in her chest for years in the form of a pressure she'd never been able to identify until it was gone. Her hands were shaking, and her jaw was tight, and she felt simultaneously emptied and more present in her own body than she had in years. "He's going to release the footage," Damien said. "Yes. And then he's going to move on us directly." "Yes. We have maybe 30 minutes before this situation becomes completely physical." He held her gaze. "Are you ready for that?" She thought about what ready meant. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 weeks ago, standing in a lobby with armed men at every corner, counting tiles. She thought about the woman who'd sat in a window seat at 3 in the morning, mapping exits. She thought about the specific kind of ready that wasn't absence of fear, but was something built on top of it, heavier and more durable. "Tell me what to do," she said. He told her. Titi. The distribution went out at 8:47 a.m. Not one outlet, not one investigator. 42 simultaneous transmissions to journalists, federal oversight bodies, 3 foreign intelligence contacts, 2 major financial regulatory agencies, and a network of advocacy organizations whose names Serafina recognized from the donation records she'd found on Mara's accidentally left folder 6 weeks ago. Her mother's files. 20 years of documentation. Released all at once, flooding every channel simultaneously, so that there was no single point of interception, no single receiver that Lucienne Vale could pressure or compromise or buy before the information was already too distributed to contain. She watched Callum run the transmission from a laptop in the back of the car. She watched the confirmation receipts come in. Green indicators, one after another, 42 of them in 90 seconds. And she held the empty drive case in her hands and breathed. "It's out," Callum said. Damien's phone rang immediately. He didn't answer. He looked at the screen and then at Serafina and said, "It starts now." And she nodded, and the car began to move. Awed. The footage hit at 9:03. She saw it on Callum's screen. Her father's communications team had pushed it to 3 major platforms simultaneously. A counterflood. The same tactic turned back. The clip was 40 seconds. Edited. Contextualized with a caption that described her as a willing participant in a meeting with a federal official, the implication layered and deliberate and exactly as damaging as she'd anticipated. She watched it once. She looked away. "How bad?" Damien said. "Bad enough to create confusion," she said. "Not bad enough to override 20 years of documented corruption if people actually read what my mother compiled." She paused. "It depends on which story moves faster." "Ours is already moving," Callum said. "The financial records are getting picked up. Overseas first, 3 wire services. The domestic outlets are slower, but they're reading." "How long before they commit?" Damien said. "An hour. Maybe less if the overseas pickup creates enough pressure." "An hour." She looked at Damien. "Mara," she said. His jaw tightened. "Still working it." "What does that mean?" "It means I have people on the location and I need 20 more minutes." "We don't have 20... Serafina." His voice was flat and controlled, and she heard the effort in the control. "I know. 15 minutes. Let me work." She sat back. She watched the city through the armored glass and counted her own heartbeats and felt the morning moving around her with the particular velocity of things that had been set in motion and could no longer be redirected, only survived. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. "Ms. Vale?" A woman's voice. Brisk, professional, carrying the specific weight of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "My name is Director Hargrove, Federal Oversight, Internal Affairs Division. I've been reviewing materials distributed in the last 11 minutes. A pause. "I need to speak with you directly. Today." Serafina closed her eyes for 1 second. "Where?" she said. The meeting point was a federal building on the north side of the financial district. Hargrove's choice, neutral ground in the specific way that federal property was never fully neutral, but was at least not her father's. They were there in 12 minutes, which was faster than Serafina had expected, and she understood as they arrived that Damien had been moving toward this location before Hargrove called, which meant he'd known this was coming or had arranged it, and she filed that information without asking about it yet. Hargrove was 50-something, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had learned to give away nothing and had been practicing for decades. She met them in a conference room on the 3rd floor and looked at Serafina for a moment before looking at Damien and then back at Serafina. "I'll speak to Ms. Vale alone," she said. "No," Damien said. "Mr. Draven, she's my wife," Damien said. "Whatever she says to you, she says with counsel present. I'm the closest thing available on short notice." He pulled out the chair at the table and looked at it with the specific economy of a man who is not asking permission. "We can debate jurisdiction after, or we can use the next 50 minutes productively. Your choice." Hargrove looked at him for a moment. She sat down. Serafina sat across from her. Damien stood. The next 40 minutes were the most concentrated conversation of Serafina's life. She answered every question Hargrove asked with the same precision she'd brought to the recorded interview. Dates, names, account numbers, specific language from specific conversations overheard in specific rooms across 20 years of being considered furniture by a man who conducted his corruption in front of her because he'd never once thought she was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. She told Hargrove about the lead investigator, the one her father owned, the one who'd opened the investigation as a pre-built weapon. Hargrove's face moved almost imperceptibly when she said the name, which told her the name was already somewhere in the morning's paperwork. She told her about the fake federal agents in the deposit facility. She told her about the secondary file, the footage, and what it showed and what it didn't show and why it had been held for 5 years as insurance rather than deployed earlier. She told her about her mother. Hargrove was quiet for a long moment after that last part. "The proxy documentation," she said. "The account registration. We'll need to verify the chain of custody." "The originals are in the drive materials," Serafina said. "My mother's handwriting, dated, notarized by an attorney who retired to the coast 8 years ago and is presumably still available for verification." Hargrove looked at her carefully. "You've been preparing for this conversation," she said. "I've been preparing for this conversation my entire life," Serafina said. "I just didn't know it." Hargrove's phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Her expression shifted by a single degree. "The lead investigator on the Vale case is currently being placed on administrative suspension pending review," she said, reading from the screen. "That happened 11 minutes ago." She set the phone down. "Your materials moved faster than expected." "My mother was thorough," Serafina said. Hargrove almost smiled. It was the smallest possible version of a smile, but it was there. Damien's phone went off. He looked at the screen and something changed in his posture. A tightening, rapid and precise. The kind of physical shift she'd learned to read as incoming. "Excuse me," he said, and walked to the corner of the room, and she heard his voice drop to its lowest register and knew without hearing the words that something had happened. She kept her eyes on Hargrove. "What happens to the lead investigator's cases?" she said. "Reassigned," Hargrove said. "The federal complaint against you is likely to be reviewed and dismissed within 48 hours given the conflict of interest." She paused. "The complaint against Mr. Draven is more complex." "He's done things," Serafina said. "Yes, but the specific charges in the complaint were built to serve my father's interests, not to reflect accurate investigation." "That's what the review will determine," Hargrove said carefully. "I'm not asking you to absolve him," Serafina said. "I'm telling you the frame was corrupt from the beginning. Whatever he answers for, he should answer for on accurate terms." Hargrove looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Noted," she said. Damien came back to the table. His face was the controlled demolition again. The version she'd first seen the night she told him about her father. She knew what it meant now. She knew the specific architecture of rage that lived inside that stillness. "Mar," she said. Not a question. "She's out," he said. "She's safe." A pause. "But your father has moved." "Where?" "The Winter Palace." He said it without inflection. He took the private convoy an hour ago. He has 12 people with him. Another pause, harder. And Evelyn. The name landed in the room like a dropped weight. Evelyn, her half-sister. 18 years old, quiet and careful in the specific way of people who had grown up in proximity to Lucy Vale and learned early that the safest posture was invisible. Serafina had seen her 3 times in the last 4 years, twice at mandatory family events, once by accident in the lobby of the Black Cathedral on the wedding night, standing in the background with her eyes down in a way that had made Serafina's chest hurt. She was a variable her father had always kept in reserve. Of course he had. Serafina stood up. "Ms. Vale," Hargrove started. "My father has taken a minor to a fortified location," Serafina said. "He's using her to create a negotiating position. How quickly can you move federal resources to the Winter Palace?" "That requires—" "How quickly?" Serafina said. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. The Winter Palace was 40 minutes north of the city, an estate that had been a government building once, decommissioned and sold to a holding company 3 years ago, converted at significant expense into something that looked like a country retreat from the outside and was a fortified position from the inside. Serafina had never been there. She knew it from the financial records, from a line item in her father's portfolio that had always seemed disproportionate for what was described as a seasonal property. She knew now what it had been built for. The convoy north was 3 vehicles. Damien's armored car, 2 more behind it carrying people whose names she still didn't know and had stopped needing to. The sky had gone the color of iron. December light, thin and directional, stripping the landscape of anything soft. She sat in the back seat with the empty drive case in her hands and thought about Evelyn. 18. The same age Serafina had been when she'd first tried to leave and been brought back and learned in the most concrete possible terms what leaving cost. She thought about what Evelyn was via in that building right now, what she understood about her situation, what she'd been told, whether she was afraid. She was definitely afraid. "How many on the inside?" Serafina said. 12 confirmed, Damien said. "Possibly more. The building has 3 underground levels, and we don't have full schematics." Exits. 4 main, 6 service. 2 that aren't on any public record but are in the original construction documents, which my people pulled 20 minutes ago. "He'll have people on all of them." "Yes. And he'll have the phone," she said. "He'll call. He'll want to negotiate." "He's already called twice," Damien said. "I haven't answered." She looked at him. "Don't," she said. "Not until we're at the gate. The longer he waits, the less controlled he is. He needs to feel like he has options. Negotiation is how he stays regulated. Take that away, and he makes mistakes." Damien looked at her. "You know him very well," he said. "I had a very long time to study him," she said. The convoy turned off the main road. Trees on both sides, bare of leaves, the branches making a skeletal architecture against the gray sky. She could see the roofline of the estate in the distance. Classical facade, columns, the pretension of legitimacy that her father had always worn the same way he wore his suits. Her phone rang. Her father's number. She looked at Damien. He said nothing. It was her call. She answered. "Don't come here." Her father's voice was different now. The smoothness abraded, something rawer underneath. Not panic. Not yet. But the early edges of it. "I'm telling you this as your father. Don't come here." "Where's Evelyn?" she said. "She's fine. She's not involved in this." "Then let her go." "When we've resolved, let her go," Serafina said. "Right now. Open a door and let her walk out and we stop this convoy and we talk. That's the only offer." "You don't make offers to me," he said, and the rawness sharpened into something she recognized. The tone that had preceded the worst of it, throughout her childhood, the specific register of a man who had lost the performance and was running on the thing beneath it. "I do now," she said. "Serafina, listen to me. You don't understand what you've done today. The people you've exposed, they won't let this stand. You think it's over because you released some files? They will dismantle everything and everyone connected to this, and you will be connected to it, and so will your... Let Evelyn go, she said. Silence. Come inside, he said. Come inside alone, and we'll talk. Leave Damien outside, just you and me, the way it should have been from the beginning. That's not going to happen. Then I can't guarantee. If you hurt her, Serafina said, and her voice had dropped to something she hadn't heard from herself before, quiet and absolute and without any of the old fear in it. There is no version of the next hour where you walk out of that building. Do you understand me? The line was silent. She's your daughter, Serafina said. She is your actual daughter, and she is 18 years old, and she has done nothing except exist inside the disaster of your life. And I am asking you for the first and last time to do one thing that is actually about her and not about you. Silence. Then, very quietly, you sound like your mother. She closed her eyes for 1 second. I know, she said. The line went dead. But the convoy stopped at the gate. 200 meters of gravel drive between the iron gate and the building's main entrance. The estate grounds were open, lawns that had gone winter brown, a long reflecting pool coated in a skin of ice, the geometry of a place designed to be seen from a distance and found impressive. Nothing moved on the grounds, no one at the gate, no visible security on the approach, which was wrong. He's pulled them inside, Damien said. He's consolidating, she said. He knows federal units are coming. He's reducing his perimeter and going to ground, which means he's not planning to negotiate. No, she said. He's planning to survive until he can reshape the narrative. He needs time. She looked at the building. He doesn't have it. The federal oversight team is 40 minutes behind us. Whatever happens, it happens before they arrive. Damien turned to look at her fully. You need to stay in this car, he said. No. Serafina, Evelyn is in there, she said. I'm the only person in that building he'll hesitate to hurt. Every other person you send through that door is a threat he can justify. I'm a problem. She held his gaze. I'm the one variable in his plan that he didn't fully account for. Use it. His jaw was tight. She could see the exact dimensions of the argument he wasn't making, the fear he wasn't performing but was carrying, the specific cost of what he was considering allowing, because she was right, and they both knew it. If anything happens to you, he said. I know, she said. I need you to know that I... He stopped. She put her hand over his. I know, she said again. Softer. He pressed his hand over hers once. Hard. Brief. Then he looked at the building. You go in the east service entrance, he said. My people have it clear. Mira goes with you. She stays on you. You don't separate under any circumstances. He looked back at her. Your job is Evelyn. Find her and get her to an outside wall. I'll do the rest. What is the rest? She said. He looked at her steadily. Everything I should have done the night you told me. Chosen. The east service entrance was a steel door behind a utility structure on the building's north face. Mira, one of Damien's mid-30s, economical in everything, had it open before Serafina fully reached it. Inside, a service corridor, concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, the institutional smell of a building that had once been government property and still carried that particular institutional emptiness in its bones. They moved fast. Mira in front, hand at her hip, eyes moving. Serafina behind, one hand on the wall, memorizing the layout as they went. Left turn, right turn, a fire door, another corridor, the sound of the building's ventilation system underneath everything like a held breath. The building was not silent. She could hear movement above them, footsteps, more than one person, the specific rhythm of people taking positions. Her father's 12, maybe more. And then a sound she knew, a voice, one floor up. Her father's, the operational register, giving directions she couldn't fully hear. And under it, quieter, the sound of someone crying, quickly controlled. Evelyn? Serafina touched Mira's shoulder and pointed up. Mira nodded. They found the stairs. The second floor was a wide corridor with tall windows on one side overlooking the frozen reflecting pool and a series of closed doors on the other. 3 of her father's men were visible at the far end. positioned, watching the main approach through the windows. Their backs were to the corridor. Mira assessed the geometry. She looked at Serafina. Serafina pointed at the third door from the left. She didn't know. She was going on something that wasn't knowledge. A resonance, a read, the accumulated sensory data of 30 years of being inside her father's logic and knowing how he organized space, knowing he'd put Evelyn somewhere visible to himself but contained, somewhere he could check on her without crossing open ground. Mira went first. The door was unlocked. Evelyn was inside, seated on the floor against the far wall, knees pulled up, one of her father's men standing near the window with his back mostly to the room. She was 18 and she looked younger, her face showing the particular emptiness of someone who had gone somewhere internal while they waited to understand whether they were going to be okay. Serafina had lived in that face. The man at the window turned. Mira moved. Serafina crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched in front of Evelyn and put both hands on her face and said, "Look at me. I'm here. You're going to be fine." And Evelyn looked at her with those eyes that carried some version of the same thing Serafina had always seen in her own mirror. The watchfulness, the endurance, the specific form of survival that their father had inadvertently taught them both. And she grabbed Serafina's wrists and held on. "Come on," Serafina said. "Right now. We're going." They were 3 steps from the door when the gunfire started. Not nearby. Below them, the main floor, the sound traveling up through the walls, the particular acoustic of a large space absorbing impact, multiple exchanges, fast and decisive. Damien's people coming through the front. Her father's men on the second floor moved toward the stairs. Mira pulled the door shut. "Other exit," she said. "Now." They ran. The service corridor connected to a secondary staircase at the building's west face. She'd seen it on the ground floor and mapped it without knowing she'd need it, and was using it now on reflex. Evelyn was fast, faster than she'd expected, running without hesitation, without the paralysis that fear sometimes produced, running with the focused efficiency of someone who had made a decision and was committed to its physical execution. They hit the west staircase and went down. Behind them, above them, the second floor erupted. She heard her father's voice, not words, just the sound of it, raised in a way she'd heard exactly twice in her life, both times in the aftermath of something irreversible. The voice of a man whose plan was collapsing around him in real time. They hit the ground floor. The west exit was a fire door with a push bar. Mira hit it without slowing, and cold air came in like a wall, and they were outside on the building's west face, the frozen grass crunching under their feet, the sky enormous and gray above the tree line. Serafina grabbed Evelyn's hand. They ran across the open ground toward the tree line. She could see the convoy vehicles beyond the gate, 2 of them repositioned to the west approach, which meant Damien had anticipated this, had planned for secondary exits, had moved pieces before she'd even asked him to. She heard the fire door behind them open. She didn't look back. She heard Mira say something sharp, and then heard a single shot, and then silence, and she kept running with Evelyn's hand in hers, and the frozen ground under her feet, and the cold air burning her lungs, and the gate getting closer, and the vehicle getting closer, and the side door opening before they reached it because whoever was driving had been watching for them. They fell inside. The door closed. The vehicle was moving before she caught her breath. She looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was breathing hard, eyes wide, still in the somewhere internal place but starting to come back from it, blinking at the interior of the vehicle and at Serafina and at the impossible fact of being outside. "Are you hurt?" Serafina said. "No." A pause. "No, I'm okay." Her voice was very young. "Is it over?" Serafina looked out the window at the Winter Palace. The main entrance had multiple vehicles in front of it now. Damien's, and behind them, just arriving, the federal units, 3 black SUVs moving fast up the gravel drive. The authority she'd set in motion that morning finally arriving at the location where it was needed. Not over. "Almost," she said. Her phone buzzed. "Damien?" She answered. "Where are you?" he said. "West vehicle. Evelyn's with me. She's okay." She pressed her hand against the window glass, cold under her palm. "Where are you?" "Inside," he said. "How bad?" A pause. Your father is in the main hall, he said. He has 2 men left. The federal team is at the front entrance. Another pause. He wants to talk to you. The vehicle had stopped. She looked at Eveline. Stay here, she said. Serafina, Mira stays with you. You do not get out of this vehicle. She held Eveline's gaze. I need you to trust me for 10 more minutes. Eveline looked at her with those careful, watchful eyes. Okay, she said. Serafina got out of the vehicle. The cold hit her immediately. December air, still and sharp, carrying the smell of the frozen ground and something underneath it, something acrid and spent from the interior of the building. She walked toward the main entrance. The federal agents at the door looked at her and then looked at their comms and then stepped aside, which meant Hargrove had called ahead, which meant someone was managing this at a level above the immediate chaos. She walked through the main doors of the Winter Palace and into the entry hall. The hall was enormous. Marble floors, high ceilings, the architectural pretension of a building that had once housed government ambition. There were 2 of Damien's men at the far end. One of her father's men was on the floor. Not dead, she thought, just down. Another doorway opened to the left into what had been a ballroom, and that was where the voices were, and she walked toward it. She stopped in the doorway. Damien was in the center of the ballroom. Her father was 20 feet from him. Between them, the specific geometry of 2 people who had run out of intermediaries. Her father looked smaller than she'd ever seen him. Not physically. He was still the same dimensions, still the navy suit, still the cultivated bearing of a man who had spent decades performing authority. But something had gone out of the performance. The frame had dropped, or cracked, or simply become too expensive to maintain while his operation collapsed around him floor by floor. He had a gun. His hand was steady. She'd give him that. Whatever was happening in his face, his hand was steady, which told her what kind of man he was at the bottom of everything. Not the kind who shook when it came down to it, not the kind who fell apart when consequences arrived. The kind who held on. The kind who fought for position until the position was definitively, physically, permanently gone. Damien was looking at him with the gray eyes and the stillness. Neither of them had looked at the doorway yet. She stepped inside. Her father saw her first. Something moved in his face, complex and layered, and she was close enough to read it, close enough to see the parts of it. The anger, the calculation, the grief, which surprised her, genuine and suppressed, which she filed without letting it destabilize her. And underneath all of it, the fear. Not of Damien, of her, of what she knew and what she'd done and what she would continue to do because she was still standing, still here, still the person he had spent 30 years trying to manage into silence. Put it down, she said, her voice in the enormous room, steady, strange to her own ears in its steadiness. Her father looked at her. I gave you everything, he said. She looked at him. You gave me nothing, she said. You built a version of me that was useful to you. That's not the same thing. I protected you. From what? She said. From what did you protect me? From the world outside your house, while destroying me inside it? From every person who might have actually... She stopped. Breathed. Put the gun down. It's done. The files are out. The investigation is reassigned. Hargrove's team is at your door. There is no version of the next 10 minutes where this gun helps you. He looked at Damien. You turned her against me, he said. No, Damien said. You did that yourself. I just stopped being in the way. Her father's hand tightened on the gun. She saw it. She saw what was coming before it came. That particular quality of a person arriving at the end of their options and choosing the only form of control remaining. She saw it in the angle of his wrist and the shift of his weight and the way his eyes moved past Damien to the middle distance of a man making a calculation that had already resolved. Don't, she said. He looked at her. I'm your father, he said, like it was an argument, like it had ever meant what it was supposed to mean. I know, she said. His hand moved, and Serafina slammed her forearm into Damien's shoulder, throwing herself between them, because her father's gun was moving toward Damien, and every calculation in her body resolved to the same answer simultaneously. Not strategic, not planned, just the most fundamental physics of what she had become over 6 weeks in the Black Cathedral, The irreducible fact of what she would and would not allow to be taken from her. The shot went wide. Damien caught her before she lost her footing. Her father stood with the gun still raised, breathing hard, looking at his daughter standing in front of the man he'd intended to kill, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to finally, definitively, complete something. His arm lowered. Not from defeat, exactly. From recognition. The federal agents came through the ballroom doorway at a controlled run. Hargrove was behind them, and Serafina registered the sound of it all. The voices, the commands, the specific language of legal authority arriving to collect what was owed, registered it from inside Damien's arms where she had ended up. His hands on her arms, making sure she was standing, making sure she was real, making sure she was still. Damien's hands were still on her arms. She could feel his heartbeat where her back pressed against his chest. Fast, not yet settled. The biology of a man who had just watched someone step in front of a bullet meant for him and was still processing what that meant. His grip was careful, the way it was always careful, the way she'd learned to read his hands as a separate language from everything else about him. A language that had no deception in it, that said only what it meant. The federal agents moved past them into the ballroom. Her father was on his knees on the marble floor, not forced down. He had lowered himself, which was different and worse in some way she couldn't fully articulate. Voluntary surrender had a specific quality, a deliberateness that felt more final than being taken down. He was on his knees with his wrists held out and his gun on the floor 3 feet away, and his face doing something she had never seen it do in 30 years of studying it for survival. He was looking at her. Not at Hargrove, not at the agents, at Serafina. And the look was not anger, not calculation, not the performance of a man managing his presentation under duress. It was the stripped look of someone who had lost not just the battle, but the internal structure that had made the battle feel worth fighting, and what was left underneath was old and unresolved and deeply, irrevocably too late. She looked back at him. She didn't move toward him. She didn't speak. She stood inside the careful weight of Damien's hands and looked at her father on the marble floor of a building he'd fortified against consequences that had arrived anyway, and she let herself feel the full dimensions of it without flinching. The grief that wasn't grief exactly, the anger that had burned so long it had become something quieter and more permanent, the specific sorrow of a child who had spent 30 years waiting for a parent to become something other than what they were. He never had. He was still that person, even now, even here. The agents cuffed him. He didn't resist. As they walked him toward the doorway, he turned his head once, not the whole body, just the head. That precise, controlled movement she'd watched from the other end of 100 dinner tables, and looked at her one final time. She didn't look away. She let him see her standing there, upright, present, still. He disappeared through the doorway, and the sound of his footsteps receded across marble, and then the building swallowed him, and she stood in the cold ballroom air and breathed. Damien's hands released her arms slowly. She turned around. He was looking at her face with the thorough attention she'd learned to stop flinching from, and she could see him doing the same thing she was doing, taking inventory, checking the structural integrity of the person standing in front of him after everything that had just happened. "You stepped in front of it," he said. "Yes." "Don't ever—" "I know," she said. "Serafina." "I know." She met his eyes. "I know. I'm telling you I know, and I'm telling you I would do it again. And I understand that's not what you want to hear, but it's the true thing, so that's what I'm giving you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put one hand against the side of her face, the same gesture as before, in the armored car, the one that didn't have ownership in it, and she felt her jaw loosen under it, felt the tight architecture of the last 6 hours begin the very first stage of unwinding. "Let's get out of this building," he said. Evelyn was still in the vehicle when they came out. She was sitting with her knees up and her arms around them, the posture so precisely mirroring something Serafina had seen in her own reflection that it produced a physical sensation somewhere in the middle of her chest. Mira was beside her, not speaking, just present, which Serafina recognized as the specific form of kindness that Mira deployed. The presence without performance, the company without pressure. Serafina opened the vehicle door and sat down beside her sister. Evelyn looked at her. "Is he—" she started. "Detained," Serafina said. Federal custody. He'll be processed today. She paused. He won't come back from this. Evelyn absorbed that. She had her mother's eyes. Not Serafina's mother, a different woman, someone she'd never fully known, another of Lucien Vale's consuming relationships. But there was something in the bone structure, in the quality of the watchfulness, that crossed the boundary of different mothers and landed somewhere recognizable. I didn't know about most of it, Evelyn said. I know. Some of it. She looked at her hands. I knew some of it, and I didn't. She stopped. You were inside it, Serafina said. You were inside it, and you were 18, and there's nothing you could have done that wouldn't have cost you something you couldn't afford to lose. She waited until Evelyn looked at her. That's not a failing. That's a condition. Do you understand the difference? A long moment. Maybe, Evelyn said. You'll understand it more later, Serafina said. It takes time. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Where do I go? She said. Practically, not pathetically. Practically, the voice of someone who was taking stock and making plans, which Serafina found more hopeful than tears would have been. You come with me, Serafina said. For now. And then we figure out the rest together. She paused. You don't have to figure anything out today. Evelyn looked at her. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone more. She gestured vaguely. Finished. Like you had it handled. Serafina almost laughed. The sound that came out was smaller than a laugh, but it was in the same family. I don't have it handled, she said. I just kept moving. Evelyn looked out the window at the Winter Palace. The federal vehicles, the agents moving in and out, the systematic dismantling of her father's last position. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. Hargrove found Serafina outside the vehicle an hour later. The federal operation had settled into its procedural phase, the organized collection of evidence, the securing of the building, the particular bureaucratic rhythm of consequence being administered. The chaos had a shape now. It was still large, but it was contained, and contained chaos was something Serafina knew how to exist beside. The complaint is suspended, Hargrove said. She had a tablet in one hand and the same composed face she'd worn through the conference room meeting. Professional, genuinely precise, the face of someone who had seen enough to stop being surprised but retained the ability to engage. Both complaints, Serafina said. It was not quite a question. The one against you, yes, effective immediately. Hargrove paused. The one against your husband is more complex. He is not a clean individual. No, Serafina agreed. The investigation into his organization will continue, Hargrove said, under legitimate management, not under compromised oversight. Whatever that process produces, it will produce on honest terms. That's all I asked for. I know. Hargrove looked at her carefully. What your mother built, the documentation, it's significant. It's going to take months to work through all of it. There will be testimony required. Depositions, possibly open proceedings. I know. It won't be easy, Serafina said. I know. Nothing about this has been easy. I don't expect the end of it to be different. She looked at the building. I'll be there for all of it. Hargrove nodded once. One more thing, she said. She reached into her jacket and produced an envelope. A different one, official, bearing the logo of her department. The proxy documentation. Your mother's. We had a standing verification protocol, and our legal team reviewed it this morning. She held it out. The registration is valid. The account and its contents belong to you by unbroken chain of custody. She paused. As they always have. Serafina took the envelope. She held it in both hands. She thought about her mother in a room with a notary and a dwindling amount of time, doing the most concrete thing she could do with what remained. She thought about what it cost to hope that far forward, to build something for a future you weren't going to see, for a daughter you were leaving behind in the worst possible circumstances, and to do it anyway because the alternative was doing nothing. Thank you, she said. Hargrove left. Serafina stood in the winter air with the envelope and the drive case and the ring on her finger and the specific weight of a day that had changed the shape of everything, and she breathed and let the cold fill her lungs and felt herself still standing. Damien found her there. He came out of the building's west face with his jacket open and blood that wasn't his still on one sleeve, which she'd address later, and he stood beside her and looked at the same middle distance she was looking at, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "The building's clear," he said. "I know, I heard. Hargrove's team will be here until tomorrow." "I know that too." A pause. "Evelyn," he said. "She's okay." Serafina looked at him. "She's going to need time. She's going to need a lot of things. But she's functional and she's here, and that's enough for today." He nodded. She looked back at the distance. "There's going to be an investigation into your organization," she said. "I know." Hargrove said it proceeds on legitimate terms, which means I don't know what it finds. "Neither do I," he said. "Not entirely." "Are you afraid of what it finds?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some of it," he said. She appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated reassurance. "What did you do?" she said. "Specifically, the worst of it." He looked at her. "You want that conversation now?" "I want it before we go any further," she said. "I need to know what I'm standing beside. I've been standing beside things my whole life without knowing what they were, and I'm done with that. Tell me the worst of it and let me decide." He held her gaze. Then he told her. Not all of it. She understood there was a volume to it that couldn't be rendered in a single conversation on a winter lawn, and she wasn't asking for that. She was asking for the shape of it, the nature, the category of what he had done and chosen and been responsible for, and he gave her that with the same flatness he brought to everything. No performance of guilt, no performance of pride, just the honest inventory of a man who had built a certain kind of life and knew exactly what it had cost. She listened. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. When he finished, the winter air sat between them for a long moment. "You funded the shelters," she said. "Yes." "The same money?" "Yes." "Is that how you managed it?" she said. Not an accusation. A genuine question about the internal architecture of a person who had done the things he'd done and remained the person she'd come to know. "Partially," he said. "The other part is—" He stopped. "I don't have a clean answer for how I managed it. I have the answer I told myself, which worked for a long time, and I have what you've complicated that answer into, which doesn't work as simply anymore." "What did I complicate it into?" He looked at her. "The awareness," he said, "that the accounting doesn't actually balance, that you can't fund enough shelters to neutralize enough harm, that at some point the ledger is what the ledger is, and you have to decide what you're going to do next, rather than how to justify what came before." She looked at him for a long time. "What are you going to do next?" she said. He held her gaze. "Whatever you'll let me," he said. Quiet, stripped, the most unguarded thing she'd heard from him. She looked at the Winter Palace, at the federal vehicles, at the procedural machinery of accountability doing its slow, imperfect, essential work. "I'm not a redemption story," she said. "I'm not here to save you or transform you or give your violence a purpose. If you do better, it's because you chose it, not because of me." "I know." "And I'm not finished being angry," she said, "about my father, about what was done to me, about a lot of things. That anger doesn't go away because the man responsible is in handcuffs." "I know that too. And there will be things in the investigation." "Serafina," he said her name quietly. "I know, all of it. I'm not asking you to resolve anything today." He paused. "I'm just asking if you're still here." She looked at him. "I'm still here," she said. They drove back to the city as the afternoon light went flat and gray, and the trees along the highway stood bare against a sky the color of old silver. Evelyn slept in the back seat. Actually slept, not the strategic unconsciousness of someone performing rest, but real sleep, the sudden total drop of a body that had been running on adrenaline for hours and had finally been given permission to stop. She leaned against the window with her mouth slightly open and her hands loose in her lap, and she looked, for the first time since Serafina had seen her, like her actual age. Serafina watched her for a moment. Then she took out the envelope her mother had left. She'd been carrying it for hours, against her ribs in the vault, in her jacket pocket through the drive in the Federal Building and the Winter Palace. She'd taken it out once, in the armored car, and handed it to Damien, and he'd held it carefully for the duration of that particular crisis, and handed it back when she'd asked. It was lighter than it should have been for something this heavy. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. Her mother's handwriting, the careful left-leaning script she'd been trying to preserve in memory for 20 years and finding it blur at the edges the way memories did. It was dated 3 weeks before Eleanor Vale's death. The paper was ivory, slightly yellowed at the corners, the pen marks still dark. Serafina, I don't know when you'll read this or who will be with you when you do. I don't know what kind of woman you've become. I think I know the shape of it. You were always clearer than you knew, always watching with more intelligence than anyone gave you credit for. I'm sorry I couldn't protect that. What I'm leaving you is what I spent the last months building because I couldn't find another way to help you. I don't know if it will be enough. I hope it is. I hope you found a way to use it, and I hope you're reading this on the other side of something rather than in the middle of it. The most important thing I want to tell you is this. What he did to you was not your inheritance. The damage is real, but it is not the truth of you. The truth of you is the person who survived it. Those are not the same thing, and it matters that you understand the difference. I failed you in specific ways I can't undo. I stayed when I should have left. I told myself I was protecting you, and I was protecting myself, and I knew the difference, and chose to look away from it. That is mine to carry. It is not yours. You are allowed to be angry about that. You're also allowed, if you choose, to put it down eventually. Not for him, not for me, for you. Because you are the one who has to keep living inside whatever you're carrying, and you deserve the weight to be something you chose rather than something you inherited. I love you in the way that tries to be useful rather than just felt. I hope the difference matters. Your mother Serafina sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The highway moved under the car. The light outside went from gray to the dark copper of early winter evening, the kind of light that looked like something ending, which she supposed it was. She folded the letter along its original creases. She put it back in the envelope. She didn't cry, not because the grief wasn't there. It was there, enormous and old and present, but because crying felt like less than what the letter deserved. What it deserved was exactly what she was giving it, stillness and full attention, and the acknowledgement that the person who wrote it had done something extraordinary with what she had, and that it had been enough. Damien was looking at the road. He didn't ask. She put her hand on his. He turned his palm up and held it. 6 months. The Black Cathedral was different after. Not structurally. It was still 40 stories of obsidian glass and cold harbor light, still armed men at floors, still the architecture of a particular kind of power. But the residential level had changed in the way that spaces changed when the people inside them changed, accumulated by degrees slowly, the way warmth accumulated in a room that had been cold for a long time. Serafina's drawings were on the walls now. Not all of them. Not the raw ones. The ones from the first weeks when she'd been processing everything she couldn't say, when the charcoal had been less art and more excavation. Those lived in a flat file in the studio she'd claimed on the west side of the residential level, the room with the best north light and the view of the harbor that she found she needed in the same way she needed the lock on her door. Not because she used it, but because it existed. The walls held the later ones, the harbor in winter. Mara, who had come back 3 weeks after her ordeal with the same economical composure and a slightly different quality of watchfulness that Serafina recognized and respected. Evelyn, asleep in the back seat of the armored car, her face for once completely unguarded. A portrait of her mother done from memory. Approximate, imperfect, assembled from 20 years of trying to preserve a face that receded the way all faces did, but recognizable in the things that mattered. And one of Damien. Not the first one. The outline from the window, the architectural sketch of a man she'd only just begun to learn. This one was different, closer. She'd drawn it from the kitchen table, 3 months in, On a Tuesday evening, when he was working through documents at the other end and the light was doing something specific to the angles of his face, and she'd picked up the charcoal without thinking, he was looking slightly off to the side. Something in his expression that wasn't the controlled demolition, wasn't the operational stillness, wasn't any of the registers she'd cataloged in the first weeks. It was simpler than all of those. It was a man in a room where he was not performing anything for anyone, and she'd caught it. He'd seen it the morning after she hung it. He'd stood in the hallway and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "You're going to tell me I made you look human again," she'd said from the kitchen. "No," he'd said. He'd looked at it a moment longer. "You made me look like I'm thinking about something specific." "You were. How do you know?" "Because I was watching you." He'd looked at her. "What was I thinking about?" "I don't know," she'd said. "That's what makes it interesting." "What?" The depositions took 4 months. 17 sessions across 2 federal investigations, the corruption case built on her mother's documentation, and the separate inquiry into the organized crime network that had been operating under compromised federal protection for a decade. She attended everyone. She answered every question with the same precision she'd brought to the conference room with Hargrove, and she did not perform distress, and she did not perform resilience, and she did not look at the cameras that were sometimes present, and she did not shape her answers for any audience except the accurate record. It was the most exhausting thing she had ever done. More exhausting than running, more exhausting than the Winter Palace, more exhausting even than the 20 years of managed survival inside her father's house, because at least then she'd been operating on instinct, on reflexes honed by necessity, on the automatic systems of a person who has learned to function under continuous threat. This was deliberate. This was choosing, again and again and again, to be present and accurate and unflinching in front of people who were trying to build a legal structure out of her experience, and it cost something specific every time. Damien drove her to every session. He waited in the car. He never came in, understood without being told that this was hers, that the precision of it required her full ownership, that having him in the room would shift the weight of it in ways she didn't want. But he was always there when she came out, and he always had coffee, and he never asked how it went until she was ready to tell him. And sometimes she wasn't ready until the next morning, and he accepted that with the same economy of comment he brought to most things. Mara accompanied her twice, when the testimony overlapped with events Mara had witnessed directly. She was precise and devastatingly credible and composed in a way that made the opposing counsel visibly frustrated. Evelyn testified once. She was 20 by then, had crossed the threshold quietly, with a small dinner in the residential-level kitchen, Serafina and Mara and Damien, and a person from Evelyn's university program she'd introduced without explanation, and who had the particular ease of someone Evelyn had chosen entirely for herself. That had meant something, the choosing entirely for herself. Her testimony was limited in scope. She was a secondary witness to specific events, not a central figure in the corruption architecture. But she gave it with a directness that surprised the room, and Serafina, watching from outside the testimony chamber, had felt the specific pride of someone watching a person discover that they are more than what they were built to be. Lucien Vale's trial was separate. She testified at his trial. She had known she would. She had prepared for it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything now, which was something that had happened gradually without her noticing. The shift from survival thoroughness to choice thoroughness, from the meticulous attention of someone managing threats to the meticulous attention of someone who had decided their own life was worth building carefully. She took the stand. She looked at her father. He was in a gray suit. His attorney had clearly counseled the gray suit as something warmer, less severe than navy, an attempt at visual humanization. He sat with the same composed bearing he'd always had, but the frame had been gone since the marble floor of the Winter Palace, and what remained without it was something smaller and more ordinary than the figure she'd grown up measuring herself against. Just a man, capable of tremendous damage, responsible for specific harm, sitting in a courtroom in a gray suit waiting for his daughter to speak. She spoke for 3 hours. She said every true thing. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She did not shape her account toward any desired outcome except accuracy, because accuracy was the thing her mother had spent her last months building, and it was the thing Serafina had carried for 6 months through depositions and testimony and the specific exhausting work of refusing to let it be simplified. And she was not going to undermine it now with anything that wasn't entirely, verifiably true. When the opposing counsel asked her, on cross-examination, whether she believed her father had acted out of anything other than malicious intent, she was quiet for a moment. The courtroom waited. She thought about the crack in his voice on the phone, the look on his face in the ballroom, the specific grief she'd seen there, real grief, genuine, buried under everything else but present. "He's capable of feeling things," she said. "I believe that. I believe some of what he did was motivated by fear rather than solely by calculation." She paused. "I don't believe that changes what he did. I believe those things can be true simultaneously, that he was afraid and he was calculating and he caused real harm, and those are all the same person. I'm not here to determine which one is most true. I'm here to tell you what happened." The courtroom was quiet. The opposing counsel looked at his notes. He had no follow-up. The verdict came in on a Thursday. She was in the studio when Damien told her. She had charcoal on her hands and a half-finished piece on the board. Something she'd been working on for 3 weeks, the harbor in a specific kind of morning light, a quality of stillness she kept trying to render and kept getting slightly wrong. He came to the doorway. He said the word, "guilty." She turned around. She looked at him. She breathed in once, slowly, through her nose. She said, "Okay." She turned back to the drawing. She worked for another 40 minutes in silence while he sat in the chair near the window and didn't leave. And she found the thing she'd been trying to find in the harbor piece, a slight softening in the light at the horizon, the place where the water and the sky did something together that wasn't merger but was proximity, two separate things existing side by side at a specific distance. And she got it right. She stepped back. She looked at it. She put down the charcoal. She turned around and crossed the studio, and Damien stood when she moved toward him, and she walked into his arms and stood there in the north light, with charcoal on her hands and her face against his chest, and felt the verdict settle into the architecture of her. Not as closure exactly, because closure was a simpler thing than this, because some rooms stayed open, because some scars stayed shaped around the weight that was no longer there, because she was not finished grieving and not finished being angry, and not finished with any of it in the way that meant finished. But the account was settled. Her mother's work had done what it was built to do. She held on to that. They left the Black Cathedral in January. Not permanently. Damien still had operations that required the infrastructure. And she didn't ask him to abandon what he'd built any more than she'd asked him to become something he wasn't. But they found a place on the coast, an hour north of the city, a house on a cliff with the ocean on 3 sides and windows that let in light from every direction. It needed work. The kitchen was outdated and 2 of the upstairs rooms had damage in the walls, and the garden had gone completely wild over what looked like several seasons of nobody paying attention to it. She walked through it the first time with Damien and cataloged everything that needed fixing with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime assessing structural damage and knew the difference between what was cosmetic and what went to the foundation. The foundation was sound. That was the thing. She stood in the main room with its view of the ocean and the winter light coming in cold and clean, and she felt the specific quiet of a space that had no accumulated history for her, no rooms mapped for exits, no corners calibrated against consequences, no air carrying the frequency of someone else's authority. Just space, empty and available and hers to fill. Eveline came on weekends sometimes, taking the train up from the city with her particular ease of movement that had developed gradually over the months. The ease of someone learning that they could occupy space without needing to justify the occupation. She and Serafina were not close in the way that shared childhoods produced closeness. They were something else, 2 people with the same originating damage building toward each other from different directions, finding that the damage overlapped in useful ways, that they recognized in each other the specific fluency of survivors. Mara came twice and stayed for a week each time, which was the most intimacy her nature allowed and which Serafina accepted with exactly the appreciation it deserved. Callum sent a plant, which they put in the south window and which neither of them killed for the remainder of the winter, which felt like a reasonable omen. On a night in late February, Serafina sat at the work table in the room she'd claimed for the studio, smaller than the one in the Black Cathedral, better light, and opened the flat file. She took out the drawings from the first weeks, the raw ones. She looked at them one at a time. The harbor at 3 in the morning. The architectural sketch of a man she hadn't known yet. A woman's face that was her own, done once in a dissociated state she could barely remember, looking at herself from the outside because the inside had been temporarily uninhabitable. She looked at them for a long time, then she put them back. She didn't destroy them. She didn't frame them. She filed them in the flat file in the order she'd made them and closed the drawer because they were true, and they were hers, and the fact that they were painful didn't make them something to discard. She picked up a fresh sheet. She sat at the work table with the charcoal in her hands and the ocean sound coming through the walls. The particular continuous sound of it, larger than any room, indifferent in the way that large things were indifferent, which she found not desolating but calming. And she thought about what she wanted to make, not what she needed to make, not what she was processing, what she wanted. She started. It wasn't the harbor. It wasn't a face. It was something more abstract, a quality of light, a spatial feeling, the specific texture of a room where you could stand in the middle and hear nothing that required a response. She worked until her hand cramped, and then she worked a little longer. And when she finally put the charcoal down, she looked at what she'd made and found it imperfect and true. She heard Damien in the kitchen. The particular sound of his movements there. He'd learned the kitchen over weeks, learned the coffee equipment and the drawer organization and the specific rhythm of a space that belonged to both of them. And the sound of it was ordinary in a way that had accumulated its own meaning by being consistent. By being there the next morning and the morning after that. She set the drawing aside. She went to the kitchen. He was at the counter, his back to her, doing something that involved the coffee equipment and a focus that was slightly out of proportion to the task, which meant he was thinking about something he hadn't said yet. She'd learned to read that. She sat at the kitchen table. The ocean was visible from the window here. Just the edge of it, the dark line of the horizon against the night sky. In daylight it was enormous and present, and in darkness it was that line, that edge, the boundary between one thing and another. Hargrove called this afternoon, Damien said. I know. I'll call her back tomorrow. She paused. What are you thinking about? He turned around. He had the coffee cups in both hands, and he set them on the table and sat down across from her, and held her gaze in the specific way he held it when he was deciding between two versions of something. I've been meeting with a firm, he said. Corporate restructuring. There are parts of what I have that can be made legitimate. Not all of it. But enough of it that the investigation, whatever it finds, doesn't have to mean dismantling everything. He paused. I started those meetings 2 months ago. I know, she said. He looked at her. You knew. Callum mentioned it by accident. She picked up her coffee. I didn't ask him about it. Why didn't you say anything? Because it wasn't mine to say anything about, she said. You chose it. That's the point. She held his gaze. Is it moving forward? Yes. He looked at the table for a moment. Some of the investigation outcomes will still be significant. There are things I can't restructure into legitimacy. There are consequences I'll have to accept. I know. I need you to know specifically, he said, not in general, the specific list. Then tell me the specific list, she said. He told her. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee and at the dark line of the horizon through the window. Okay, she said. Okay, he said, like he was verifying it. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I told you that. I meant it with the information I had then, and I mean it with this information now. She looked at him. But I need you to keep telling me the list as it changes. No managed versions, no edited account, the actual list. Yes, he said, because I've spent enough of my life inside edited accounts. I know. And I'm done with it. I know, he said. I know that. He held her gaze with the gray eyes and the attention that missed nothing, and she sat with the full weight of it and did not look away. You're the only person I've ever told the actual list. She looked at him. Then we're even, she said, because you're the only person I've ever been the actual me around. The kitchen was quiet. The ocean sound came through the walls, continuous and large, and the coffee was warm between her hands, and the room was lit by two lamps that cast the light at the particular angle that made spaces feel inhabited rather than occupied. And Damien Draven was sitting across from her at a kitchen table on a cliff above the winter ocean, looking at her like she was the most specific and irreplaceable thing he had ever been allowed to be near. She had started this as a transaction, her father's trade, his insurance, a chain disguised as a ring. She had stood in a lobby with armed men at every corner and counted tiles. She had mapped exits in a penthouse and sat in window seats at 3 a.m. and drawn the outline of a man she feared and found, in the drawing, that what she'd feared and what he was were two different things, and then lived inside that difference long enough to understand its dimensions. She had told the truth on a stand in a courthouse and put her mother's work into the world and let the weight of it accomplish what it had always been built to accomplish. She had stepped in front of a bullet. She had opened a letter. She had learned the difference between the damage and the truth of her. She turned the ring on her finger once, not the flat dark band from the ceremony, which she'd removed 2 months in and returned to him without comment, and he'd accepted without comment, understanding without words the specific meaning of a gesture that didn't require them. The ring she wore now she'd chosen herself. Plain, warm-toned, unremarkable. The kind of ring that announced nothing to anyone who looked at it and meant everything to the person who'd put it on. The kind of thing you chose because you wanted it, not because you had to. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the dark line of the ocean through the window. She had survived the wrong family and the wrong house and the specific violence of being loved poorly by someone who should have known better. And she had survived the long education of her own damage and the longer education of learning to distinguish it from herself. She had survived. And then, which was the harder thing, the less instinctive thing, the thing that required choosing every day rather than being carried by necessity, she had stayed. Not shivering, not counting tiles, not waiting for the next correction. She had stayed in the warmth of a life she had built from the material available, with the imperfect person across the table from her, in a house that needed work and had good bones and let in light from every direction. She looked at Damien. He was looking back at her. "What?" he said. She shook her head once, small smile. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just here." And she was.